Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Let everything slow down. Because tonight, we're going somewhere familiar. A little town with a nuclear power plant on the hill and a yellow sky, and a family on a couch who never quite seem to change. We're going to Springfield, and we're going to stay there a while. The Simpsons has been on television since the 17th of December, 1989, 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. It is the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running sitcom, and the longest-running scripted primetime show in the entire history of television. More people around the world can picture Homer Simpson's face than can name the capital of most countries. The show has existed for so long, aired in so many countries, been translated into so many languages, that it has quietly become one of the most universal cultural artifacts humanity has ever produced. And yet, for all the analysis, all the retrospectives, all the think pieces and YouTube essays and Reddit threads, there are layers to Springfield that most people have never reached. Theories so carefully constructed, so deeply embedded in the show's own canonical evidence, that engaging with them changes the way the show feels, fundamentally, permanently. So, settle in. Let your eyes grow heavy. You don't need to track every word. Let the story wash over you. Because what we're going to do tonight is take a long, slow walk through Springfield, and by the time we're done, you'll understand this town in a way that most people never do. Let's begin with the thing hiding in plain sight. The thing that has been visible in every single episode since the very first season. The structure that dominates Springfield's skyline in nearly every outdoor shot. The institution that employs half the town, powers every home, and has never, in 36 years, been held accountable for what it's been doing to the people who live in its shadow. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. Take a moment and just think about that building. 2 massive cooling towers. A faint glow on the horizon at night. The kind of facility that, in the real world, would be surrounded by exclusion zones and monitored by federal regulators and staffed by people with advanced engineering degrees. In Springfield, it is staffed by Homer Simpson, a man whose intelligence the show's own creator has placed at roughly the level of a 10-year-old child on a bad day. And that's where the theory begins. Not with something obscure, not with a throwaway line in a season 24 episode that nobody remembers. It begins with the most obvious thing in the entire show, sitting right there on the hill, leaking quietly into the water table, and the question the show has been asking without ever saying out loud for 3.5 decades. What has that plant been doing to everyone who lives downwind of it? The show gives us the answer piece by piece, spread across hundreds of episodes, delivered as jokes and background details, and cutaway gags that most viewers absorb and immediately forget. But when you pull all of those pieces together, when you lay them side by side and look at what they're actually describing, the picture that emerges is genuinely disturbing. Springfield isn't a quirky cartoon town with a few eccentric residents and a lovable buffoon at its center. Springfield is a contamination zone, and the show has been telling you that since at least season 2. Let's start with what we know for certain about the plant itself. It is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It has been found, on at least one occasion, to be in violation of 342 separate safety regulations. 342. The estimated cost to bring the facility up to code was $56 million, and the man who owns it, Charles Montgomery Burns, chose not to spend that money. Not because he couldn't afford it. Burns is a billionaire many times over, a man whose personal fortune has been described across multiple episodes as essentially incalculable. He chose not to fix the violations because fixing them would have required acknowledging they existed, and acknowledging they existed would have invited exactly the kind of scrutiny he has spent a century avoiding. The violations themselves are not minor paperwork issues. The show depicts radioactive waste being disposed of directly into bodies of water, radioactive material being stored in ways that expose residential areas to contamination, cooling infrastructure that has been patched with chewing gum rather than properly maintained, rodents that glow in the dark running through the facility's walls. And then, almost mentioned as an afterthought, something the show drops into an inspection scene and never returns to: human skeletons. In the basement. Bones in the basement of an active nuclear reactor facility. No explanation is offered. No investigation is conducted. The inspector notes it, the show moves on, and Springfield keeps going about its business as though the discovery of human remains inside a power plant is the kind of thing that just happens sometimes. The man responsible for preventing all of this from reaching the town outside is Homer Simpson. Homer has worked at the plant for the entirety of his adult life, and his job title, Safety Inspector, is one of the most frightening combinations of words the show has ever produced. This is a man who sleeps at his workstation, who has caused at least one nuclear near-miss by throwing food into the reactor core out of curiosity, who, in one episode, survives a partial meltdown largely because he is too unconscious to be evacuated, and who, in a Season 12 storyline, discovers that a crayon has been lodged in his brain since childhood, physically obstructing the development of his cognitive function for his entire adult life. The crayon is important, we'll return to it, but for now, the picture is this. A nuclear facility with hundreds of safety violations, run by a billionaire who refuses to fix them, with the town's only safety inspector being a man whose brain is literally impaired by a foreign object he's been carrying since he was a small child. That's what sits on the hill above Springfield. That's what's been powering the homes and businesses of everyone who lives in this town for over 3 decades. Now, in Season 2, the show introduces something called Blinky. Blinky is a fish. Blinky is pulled from a river near the power plant by a fisherman who isn't paying particular attention, and Blinky has 3 eyes. Not in a dreamy, metaphorical sense, literally. A third eye, growing from the center of its forehead, fully formed, positioned symmetrically between the other 2. Blinky becomes a news story within the show. A candidate for governor uses the fish as evidence that Burns is contaminating the town's water supply. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it's harmless. He takes a bite, the crowd watches, and the story basically ends there. Nobody follows up, nobody tests the water again. Nobody asks what seems like the most obvious question a thinking person could ask, which is that if the fish downstream from the power plant have developed a third eye, what might be happening to the people drinking water from that same river? The answer, as far as the show is willing to say it directly, is nothing. The Simpsons are fine, the Flanderses are fine, everybody in Springfield is fine. It's just a cartoon. The fish is just a joke. 3 eyes are funny, move on. Except, if you look at the residents of Springfield with fresh eyes, something starts to register. Something you've probably normalized so thoroughly over years of watching the show that it stopped seeming unusual a long time ago. The physical characteristics shared by everyone who lives in this town. Consider Homer Simpson. His skull shape does not correspond to any recognizable human anatomy. His jaw protrudes at an angle that would be medically significant in a real person. His eyes bulge slightly from his face. He has 4 fingers on each hand, a trait shared by every single Springfield resident without exception. His healing capacity is extraordinary by any reasonable standard. A man who has been hit by cars and fallen from great heights and survived explosions and electrocution and been back at work by Monday morning without so much as a visible bruise. His pain tolerance exists in a category that has no real-world equivalent. And his cognitive function, even setting aside the crayon, exists at a level that the show itself has described as clinically impaired. Consider Marge Simpson. The same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers, hair that grows straight upward in a tower several feet tall, maintaining its exact shape through rain and wind and stress and sleep for 36 years without any visible maintenance or product. Marge, it should be noted, was briefly employed at the nuclear plant herself. She worked in that facility. She breathed that air and existed in that environment, and then went home to a house directly downwind from those cracked cooling towers. Consider the children. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were all born and raised in Springfield. All 3 have spent their entire lives drinking the water, breathing the air, living within the shadow of that facility. And all 3 display the same physical characteristics as their parents. The rounded, slightly oversized heads, the overbites, the 4-fingered hands, the yellow skin, the spiky hair on Bart and Lisa that somehow maintains its shape without any evident grooming routine. And here is the detail that makes this theory click into place in a way that's difficult to dismiss. When outsiders visit Springfield, they look different. Guest characters, celebrities, people from other towns and other cities who come into Springfield's orbit for an episode, look at how they're drawn compared to the permanent residents. Their proportions are more natural. Their features more closely approximate realistic human anatomy. Their eyes sit at a different angle in their faces. Their hands sometimes have 5 fingers. The show draws people from outside Springfield with noticeably more realistic human proportions than it draws people who live there. The explanation most viewers reach for is that this is just the art style. The Simpsons has a distinctive aesthetic, and outsiders are drawn slightly more realistically to create visual contrast. That's a reasonable explanation on a surface level. But the theory asks you to consider what that visual difference means within the internal logic of the show's universe. If we accept that these characters exist in a world where the animation style reflects reality rather than just artistic choice, then what we're seeing when an outsider walks into Springfield and looks subtly but distinctly different from the locals is a visible, observable difference between people who live inside the contamination zone and people who don't. The people inside look mutated. The people outside look normal. The animals aren't exempt either. Santa's little helper, the family dog, shares the same bulging eye proportions as his owners. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes. The wildlife around Springfield's water supply shows documented evidence of mutation. The show is not hiding this. The show literally shows you a mutated fish in Season 2 and says this is what the radiation from the power plant is doing to living organisms in this environment, and then seems to expect the audience to accept that the same radiation has had no comparable effect on the human beings living in the same environment. Burns knows. This is the part of the theory that elevates it from fan speculation to something that feels genuinely supported by the show's own storytelling. Burns knows what the plant is doing to Springfield, and the evidence for this is hidden in plain sight throughout the series. Consider the Springfield Files, a Season 8 episode in which Homer encounters what he believes is an alien in the woods near town. FBI agents are called in to investigate. The whole town becomes obsessed with finding and identifying this creature. The dramatic reveal, when it finally comes, is that the alien Homer saw was not an alien at all. It was Mr. Burns. Burns had been receiving a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so saturated with chemicals and radiation therapy, that it caused his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment had to be administered on a precise weekly schedule. Without it, he would die within 7 days. After receiving it, he wandered out of the facility in a dazed, disoriented state, barely capable of walking in a straight line, stumbling through the darkness like something that had forgotten how to be human. He glowed in the dark, literally. His body emitted visible light because of the radiation saturating his cells. And the people of Springfield saw this glowing, staggering figure in the forest, and their first instinct was extraterrestrial origin. Not radiation, not the facility at the top of the hill. An alien. That's how thoroughly this town has been conditioned against making the obvious connection. Burns's awareness of what radiation does to biological systems is not incidental. He is personally dependent on managing radiation's effects in his own body. He has private physicians and a pharmaceutical division capable of synthesizing experimental treatments that don't exist anywhere else in the medical world. He understands, at an intimate biological level, what prolonged nuclear exposure does to a living organism, because he has been living that experience for over a century, and his plant has been administering an uncontrolled, unconsented version of that same exposure to the entire population of Springfield for decades. And then there's the question of Homer's continued employment. This is the piece of the theory that shifts the whole thing from environmental negligence to something that looks more deliberate. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in a Season 6 storyline, the first thing they did upon taking control was fire Homer. Their reasoning was direct and businesslike. He was incompetent. He was a safety liability. He was exactly the kind of employee that a responsibly operated facility cannot afford. The second thing they did was commission an assessment of what it would cost to bring the plant up to code. The estimate was so large it nearly bankrupted them. Burns then bought the plant back and immediately, without hesitation, rehired Homer. Think about what that sequence of events implies. A competent safety inspector at that facility would shut it down within a week. The violations are so numerous and so severe that any inspector doing their actual job would have no choice but to report them, and once reported, the facility would face regulatory closure. Homer's incompetence isn't a bug in the plant's operation. It's a feature. It's the mechanism by which Burns ensures the violations continue. The waste keeps being disposed of improperly, the water stays contaminated, and Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply and, by extension, its economy and its population. A population that, after decades of low-level radiation exposure, might find their capacity for critical thinking somewhat diminished. The crayon returns here. In Season 12, Homer has the crayon surgically removed, and his intelligence increases dramatically. He becomes articulate, perceptive, genuinely capable of engaging with the world around him in ways he never could before. And for a short period, he sees Springfield clearly. He sees his job clearly. He sees the architecture of his own life, and he understands, with sudden, terrible clarity, how it was all put together. And it makes him miserable, so miserable that he eventually chooses to have the crayon put back, to choose cognitive impairment over the burden of genuine awareness. But the question the show never fully asks is how that crayon got there in the first place. How a child could walk around with a foreign object in his brain for his entire childhood, visiting Springfield's doctors for regular checkups, being cared for by Springfield's medical establishment, and not a single qualified professional ever noticed or, if they noticed, said anything. Either the medical community of Springfield is catastrophically incompetent, or it is compromised. And if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a town he essentially owns, then Homer's crayon might not be an accident at all. It might be something that was noticed and deliberately left in place. Because a cognitively impaired Homer Simpson is exactly the kind of safety inspector a plant like that needs. The radiation theory doesn't solve one Simpsons mystery. It solves all of them simultaneously. The floating timeline, the reset button between episodes, Homer's impossible physical resilience, the town's collective inability to acknowledge the obvious. Every strange, inexplicable thing about Springfield resolves into coherence the moment you accept that the nuclear plant has been doing to Springfield's biology and neurology exactly what you would expect: a decades-long nuclear contamination. Event to do. Springfield isn't an eccentric cartoon town. Springfield is a diagnosis. The residents aren't quirky, they're symptomatic. And the facility that provides their electricity and employs their neighbors and poisons their water isn't background scenery. It's the whole story. It has always been the whole story. Every yellow face, every four-fingered hand, every impossible recovery from an injury that should have been fatal, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset to normal, every catastrophic event that is simply never mentioned again in the next episode. It all leads back to the same cracked reactor on the hill, leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water table, doing the same quiet damage to the same population that has been breathing its output for 36 years. The plant isn't just part of the show. The plant is the show. If you're watching this late at night, go ahead and drop your location and the time in the comments. And if you want more long videos like this one, subscribe. It genuinely helps. Now let's keep going. Section 2. Homer's coma. The theory that reframes everything. Let everything slow down a little more, sink into wherever you're resting. Because this next theory is the one that, if you let it settle, changes the emotional texture of every episode you've ever watched. What if Springfield isn't real? Not in the broad, abstract sense that it's a fictional town. Something more specific than that. What if the Springfield we've been watching since roughly April of 1993 isn't a place that exists in the show's universe at all, but instead a world being generated, moment by moment, inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious in a hospital bed for decades? This is the Homer coma theory, and it is the single most discussed, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. It has been circulating online since the early days of internet fandom, refined and expanded by thousands of different contributors, and it has been explicitly acknowledged by the show's own writers. Not confirmed. Not denied in any satisfying way. Acknowledged, which is something different and, in some ways, stranger. Let's go back to the beginning. On the 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. The title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple. It was April Fool's Day, and Bart was pranking Homer. The pranks escalated, as they always do in Simpsons plots, until Bart took one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placed it inside an industrial paint shaker. He shook it until the pressure inside was, by any reasonable engineering standard, catastrophic. Then he gave it back and waited for Homer to open it. When Homer popped the tab, the explosion was violent enough to send him to the hospital. He was bedridden, recovering, lying in his hospital room in Springfield General, and he saw a vending machine across the room. He tried to reach a candy bar. The machine tipped, fell forward, and crushed him, and Homer Simpson flatlined, entered a clinically defined unconscious state, a coma. The show was careful about the language here. Not a dream, not a near-death experience, not a cutaway gag. A coma, 7 weeks long, medically confirmed within the episode's own story. The episode resolved the way most Simpsons episodes resolve. Bart wept at his father's bedside, confessed that the whole thing was his fault, and Homer sprang awake and immediately grabbed his son by the throat. And the family laughed, and everything went back to normal. Almost everything, because before the credits rolled, the show included a detail that most viewers absorbed and immediately moved past. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. Permanently. Gone, the doctor explained. Never coming back. And Homer's response to being told that he had sustained permanent neurological damage was to laugh, even though he admitted in the same breath that he wasn't sure why he was laughing. The family found this charming. Nobody found it alarming. The episode ended, and the show continued for 32 more years as if nothing unusual had happened. Unless Homer never woke up. That is the theory in its simplest form. Homer Simpson did not regain consciousness on that April day in 1993. The tearful scene at his bedside, Bart's confession, Homer's sudden awakening, all of it was the dream. Every episode that has aired since that date is a story being generated by the comatose brain of a man lying in Springfield General, drifting in and out of something that resembles sleep, but is actually a slow, decade-long process of neural deterioration. The evidence is not trivial. Consider what the show was before the coma episode. The Simpsons had been on the air for 4 seasons by the time Homer ended up in that hospital bed, and for those 4 seasons it was a particular kind of show. Grounded. Not realistic. It was always a cartoon with comedic logic, but emotionally and narratively anchored in recognizable human situations. Homer struggled with alcoholism. Marge considered whether her marriage was what she wanted it to be. Lisa developed an intense and complicated crush on a substitute teacher and had to learn to process it when he left. Bart faced the real academic consequences of not doing his schoolwork and came genuinely close to repeating a grade. These were stories about everyday domestic life, seen through a satirical lens, but rooted in the kinds of problems real families experience: financial anxiety, marital tension, the difficulty of raising children, the gap between who you want to be and who you actually are. After the coma, everything changed. And the change was not subtle. The show's entire tonal register shifted, episode by episode, into something progressively more surreal and disconnected from ordinary life. Homer went to space. Homer discovered his mother was a fugitive radical who had been living underground since the 1960s. Homer joined a secret society. Homer met God. Twice. Mr. Burns captured the Loch Ness Monster. Homer time traveled. Homer became the lead singer of a rock band, a professional boxer, a food critic, a bodyguard, an astronaut, a barbershop quartet member, a film producer, a missionary on a Pacific island, a country music star, and roughly 250 other distinct career paths, many of them in the same season. The internet has been arguing about when The Simpsons declined for roughly 20 years. Fans who loved the early seasons cite this tonal shift as the moment the show lost something essential. The writers stopped grounding the stories in real human emotion. The plots became increasingly fantastical. Homer stopped being a specific, recognizable person and became a cartoon cipher through whom any conceivable plot could be run. The coma theory says this is not a creative failure, it's a symptom. Homer's dreaming brain, generating content in the long silence of a hospital room, cannot produce the kind of stories the early show told. It can produce volume. It can produce color and noise and familiar faces and the warm sense of home. But a brain slowly losing function cannot sustain the careful emotional architecture of a well-plotted episode about Marge's depression or Lisa's loneliness. So the dreams become bigger and louder and more impossible. The plots escalate because escalation is the logic of a sleeping mind. The grounding disappears because a dreaming brain doesn't need the tether to reality that a conscious storyteller uses to keep a narrative from floating away. The Simpsons didn't get worse after season 4. Homer's brain got worse, and the show reflects that deterioration. Now add the timeline detail that gives the theory its most haunting quality. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere titled Homer the Heretic, Homer had a conversation with God, an actual face-to-face conversation, depicted straight, without irony, and God told Homer something specific during that conversation. Homer would learn the meaning of life, God said. But not yet. God told Homer that his time was coming, but it hadn't arrived. 6 months later, Homer was in a coma. The show presented this as a theological gag, a comedic bit about Homer's unusual relationship with religious experience. But read it differently for a moment. God told Homer explicitly that something was going to happen that would be significant and final, and that Homer was not yet ready for it. And 6 months later, Homer's conscious engagement with his own life ended. In the coma theory, God was telling Homer the truth. His waking time was coming to an end, and everything that followed, the dreams, the escalating impossibility, the family preserved in amber, would be the story of a man in a hospital bed holding on to the only thing he ever really cared about through the one mechanism his unconscious mind still had available to it. The aging problem is where the theory finds its most elegant argument. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge exist in a kind of permanent middle age, their faces unchanged by the passage of 3.5 decades. The show acknowledges this as a floating timeline, a production convention shared by most long-running animated series. The present is always the present. The characters don't age because the show doesn't allow them to age. The coma theory offers a different explanation, one that is simpler and considerably more affecting. Nobody ages because the man dreaming them went under in April of 1993, and the world inside his mind is frozen at the moment he last experienced it. Homer's children don't grow up because he was never there to watch them grow. His wife doesn't change because the last time he saw her, she looked exactly as she does in every episode. His friends and neighbors and colleagues all exist at the age they were when the vending machine fell. The dream preserves them because that's what dreams do. They store the world in the state it was when you last encountered it, and they hold it there, intact and unchanging, for as long as the dreamer needs it to stay. Every celebrity appearance in later seasons is consistent with this reading. Homer's brain, lying in a hospital room with a television playing and nurses talking and visitors coming and going, absorbs fragments of the outside world through its unconscious processing. Names drift in. Voices come through the fog. Cultural references accumulate. And the dreaming mind translates all of these into dream characters. Famous people wandering through Springfield for reasons that don't quite hold up to scrutiny, but feel perfectly natural within the logic of a dream. That's why the later seasons are flooded with guest appearances. It's not that Springfield became a destination for celebrities. It's that Homer's ambient absorption of external media, the television above his hospital bed, the radio down the hall, the conversations his family had while they waited for him to wake up, generated an endless supply of dream faces to populate his world with. The show's own writers have engaged with this theory directly, which is itself a kind of evidence. In season 34, the writing staff created what they described as a deliberately leaked, fake deleted scene. In the scene, Homer wakes from a long coma and it's revealed that every outlandish episode was a dream. The scene was animated, voiced, fully produced, and then the show's team announced it was fake, planted by hackers, not a real deleted scene at all. But consider what that production decision actually means. The writers sat in a room and agreed that the coma theory was worth creating an entire fake deleted scene about. They animated it, they voiced it, they built it out to the point where it could be presented as a plausible deleted moment from the show. And their response to the theory wasn't to ignore it or dismiss it as unworthy of attention. It was to engage with it so thoroughly that they created a piece of content specifically designed around it, and then delivered their denial wrapped inside a confirmation. They showed you Homer waking from a coma and told you it was a joke. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the coma theory directly in 2015. He said it was not true. He said Homer was not in a coma. He moved on. But he did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain the conversation with God 6 months before the coma. He did not address the progressive unreality of the plots, or the way the show's relationship to consequence and continuity has eroded with each passing season, decaying exactly as you would expect a dream to decay, as the mind generating it loses more and more of its coherent structure. He just said it wasn't true, and the interviewer moved on. The fans didn't move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever quite managed. It makes the whole show make sense. The aging freeze, the tonal collapse after season 4, the infinite job changes, the physical invincibility, the reset button, the way nothing ever truly changes and consequences never truly stick. All of it resolves neatly into the logic of a dream being generated by a brain that is slowly, quietly, forgetting how to be awake. There is one more dimension to the coma theory that deserves to be held gently for a moment, because it changes the emotional character of the entire show. If Homer has been dreaming since 1993, then the show is not a comedy. It is a love letter. Homer Simpson's deepest desire, the thing at the center of all of his chaotic, impulsive, often destructive behavior, is extraordinarily simple. He wants his family. He wants Marge to love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, infuriating little boy. He wants Lisa to play her saxophone. He wants Maggie to be small enough to hold. He wants Sunday evenings at 742 Evergreen Terrace to last forever, with the television on and the smell of something cooking in the kitchen and the comfortable weight of ordinary life pressing down on him. And in the coma, it does last forever. The dream gives him everything he wants, preserved perfectly, unchanging, immune to time and loss, and the inevitable dissolution that eventually comes for every family. His children never grow up, his wife never leaves, his life never ends. The Friday night dinner is always there, the couch is always warm, the beer is always cold. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. The theory suggests it is the only version of heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever have thought to ask for. A house on a street in a small town where the kids are always young and the air always smells like whatever Marge is making, and nobody ever has to say goodbye. Every time Homer survives something impossible, every time reality bends to accommodate a plot that couldn't happen in any version of the real world, every time the credits roll and everything is back to normal, the coma theory has a simple explanation. Homer's brain refused to let the story end. Because if the story ends, Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has actually passed, how old his children really are, whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting beside his bed, or waking up might not happen at all. So the dream continues. A little louder each season, a little more impossible, a little further from the grounded family stories that came before the vending machine fell. And somewhere in Springfield General, a man with 4 fingers on each hand and a peculiar skull shape lies in a hospital bed with a television playing overhead, and every night we sit down to watch The Simpsons, we are watching the inside of his dream. The show will never confirm this. The evidence is built into the structure of the show itself, and the show cannot confirm its own hidden logic without ceasing to be the show. So Homer keeps dreaming. The family stays young. The town stays yellow. And the story goes on, because in the dream, it always does. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns, the case that was never closed? Now we get to the mystery, the one that consumed an entire summer of American television in 1995 and produced a resolution that, when you examine it carefully, raises more questions than it answers. Who shot Mr. Burns? Before you answer Maggie, because, yes, the show told us it was Maggie, the official answer is in the record books and the DVD commentaries and every retrospective piece ever written about this moment in television history. But stay with me for a little while, because the official answer has holes in it, and the more you look at those holes, the more they look like they were put there on purpose. Let's go back to the summer of 1995. Season 6 of The Simpsons ended on May 21st of that year with an episode called Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. It was an event. Not just in the sense that it was a notable episode of a popular show, but a genuine cultural event, the kind that doesn't happen very often in television. The Simpsons had attempted something no animated series had ever attempted before. A genuine, carefully plotted whodunit cliffhanger, designed with enough real clues and real misdirection that viewers at home could theoretically work it out before the answer aired. Fox promoted it with extraordinary ambition. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special that treated the fictional shooting as if it were a real unsolved case, interviewing characters from the show as witnesses. A national contest invited viewers to submit their guesses for who pulled the trigger. The prize was significant enough to generate genuine participation. Thousands of entries came in. The country, or at least the television watching portion of it, spent an entire summer arguing about which cartoon character had shot a cartoon billionaire. To understand why the mystery generated so much energy, you have to understand what Burns had done in Part 1. He had, in the span of a single episode, made enemies of virtually every person in Springfield. He stole the oil well that had been discovered beneath Springfield Elementary, eliminating the school's only chance at financial stability. He bankrupted Moe's Tavern. He created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield Retirement Castle, displacing its elderly residents, including Grandpa Simpson. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. And as his grand finale, he constructed a massive mechanical disc and used it to physically block the sun from reaching Springfield, plunging the entire town into perpetual darkness, so that every resident would be forced to rely entirely on his power plant for their energy. When Smithers, his loyal assistant of decades, protested this last move, Burns fired him on the spot. By the time Burns was shot at the end of Part 1, every character the show had developed over 6 seasons had a motive. Homer, because Burns had never, in years of employment, managed to remember his name. Bart and Lisa, because their school had been gutted. Grandpa, because his home had been destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he'd lost his job. Moe, because his livelihood was gone. Smithers, freshly fired, and by the episode's end, apparently drinking alone. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns, and the tension was so thick that multiple characters could be seen holding weapons. Then Burns was shot, a single bullet wound. He staggered out of the meeting, made it to the town sundial, collapsed with his hands falling across 2 letters. 2 letters that, read one way, spelled W and S, and read from the other direction, from Burns's perspective lying on the dial, spelled M and S. America waited 3 months to find out what that meant. In September 1995, Part 2 aired. The resolution was built around a comedic police procedural. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession collapsed when it became clear he had been blackout drunk during the relevant time period and had actually shot a different person entirely, old Jasper and his wooden leg, nowhere near the town meeting. The other suspects were eliminated one by one. Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente, the jazz musician Burns had offended by eliminating the school's music program, presented what the episode played as the greatest alibi in television history, a full musical number demonstrating that he had channeled his rage into artistic expression rather than violence. The investigation stalled until police discovered an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis pointed to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints were found on the gun. He was arrested. He was about to be convicted. Then Burns woke from his coma, looked around the hospital room, and identified the shooter. Baby Maggie Simpson. According to Burns's account, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He tried to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Maggie did it? Move on. Except, once more, the case was never really closed. Let's start with the contest. Thousands of entries were submitted. The show's creators, on the DVD commentary for these episodes, acknowledged that when they pulled a sample of entries to select a winner, not a single person in that sample had guessed Maggie. Nobody won. The person who received the prize was chosen at random from the pool and, since they hadn't answered correctly, received a cash payment rather than the promised prize of being animated into the show. The creators also mentioned that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online on the night the original episode aired, using a college account, but by the time the contest closed and they tried to track this person down, the account no longer existed and the person was never found. Think about what that means. The show was promoted as a solvable mystery. The creators said the clues were all there in Part 1. They built a national contest around the premise that a careful viewer could work out the answer. And when the answer was revealed, virtually nobody had reached it. Either the clues were insufficient, the red herrings too effective, or the answer didn't follow from the evidence in the way the show implied it would. Now look at the clues themselves. Burns fell on the sundial with his hands pointing at W and S, or from his perspective, M and S. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. The show presents this as a crucial piece of evidence, perhaps the central visual clue from the original episode. And then, in Part 2, Burns himself states explicitly that the way his hands landed on those letters was not intentional. He didn't deliberately position himself to spell out his attacker's initials. He just fell. He was shot, he staggered, he collapsed, and his hands happened to land where they did. The sundial clue, the most prominently featured piece of evidence in the entire mystery, was described by the victim as an accident. Then there's the matter of the gun. Burns carried a personal firearm in a holster. Sometime before the shooting, his holster is shown empty. The gun was already gone before Burns was hit. Whoever shot Burns used Burns' own weapon, which means the shooter didn't arrive at the town meeting intending to shoot anyone. They weren't armed. They came to the confrontation without a gun and then used Burns's gun against him. Most of the suspects at the meeting had brought their own weapons because they were genuinely furious enough at Burns to consider violence. The real shooter was someone who showed up without a weapon, encountered the gun by chance or by design, and used it in a moment of opportunity. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile, yes, but so does almost any other character who attended the meeting without their own weapon. Burns's last words before the shooting were, "Oh, it's you." He recognized the person who shot him. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't afraid. He acknowledged them with the mild, almost indifferent tone of someone who has just encountered a familiar acquaintance in an unexpected location. "Oh, it's you." The way you'd respond to running into a neighbor at the grocery store? Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Is there an established relationship between them? The show doesn't create one before this episode. Burns barely manages to recognize Homer Simpson, a man who has worked for him for years and whose name he cannot retain despite constant repetition. The idea that Burns would look down at a baby in a parking lot and calmly say, "Oh, it's you," as though acknowledging someone familiar, doesn't align with his characterization of someone who struggles to keep track of the people closest to him. And then there's the season 18 moment. Homer, in a casual context, claims that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it out loud, on camera, and nobody reacts. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer Simpson confesses to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line with no follow-up. Either Homer is lying, which is entirely plausible given his character, or the confession is genuine and the original verdict was wrong. There are multiple well-developed alternate theories about who actually pulled the trigger. One of the most compelling centers on Marge Simpson. The argument for Marge is structurally sound. She is a protective mother who had watched Burns's actions systematically damage her children's lives and her family's well-being. She had clear motive and the same access to the parking lot as anyone else at the meeting. And then there's the additional layer, developed across multiple episodes before the shooting, that Burns had at one point become infatuated with Marge, a fascination she firmly rejected but that Burns registered in the emotionally significant way that very old, very lonely people sometimes register even brief moments of connection. Under this reading, Burns recognized Marge in the parking lot because he had thought about her. He said, "Oh, it's you," because it was someone whose face he'd stored carefully. And when she shot him, he chose not to name her. He protected her. He woke from his coma in that hospital room, and rather than identify the woman who had genuinely hurt him, he pointed at the sundial and let the town draw its own conclusions. Maggie became the answer because Maggie was the perfect answer. An infant cannot be prosecuted. Chief Wiggum says this himself within the episode. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Blaming Maggie meant the case was closed with no consequences for anyone, and the real shooter, whoever they were, walked away clean. The Smithers ending is also worth noting. A complete alternate conclusion was produced in which Smithers was revealed as the shooter. Fully animated, fully voiced. Presented as a real alternate ending in a clip show hosted by Troy McClure. In that clip show, the Smithers ending is dismissed by pointing out that all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which Troy McClure describes as downright nutty, and then adds a reference to the O.J. Simpson trial in which, he notes, a jury famously did ignore DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show is winking. It is explicitly telling you that ignoring DNA evidence is something that happens, that official verdicts don't always match the physical record, and that the person officially blamed for a crime is not necessarily the person who committed it. The writers also seriously considered Barney Gumble as the shooter during the drafting process. They planned, for a period, to send him to prison over it. The option was abandoned, but the fact that it was seriously considered reveals something important about the construction of this mystery. The answer was not determined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was built from the ending backward, which means the clues in Part 1 were designed to support an answer that had not yet been definitively settled when Part 1 was written. And here finally is the question that the official resolution doesn't address. Springfield is not a town known for restraint. This is a population that forms mobs over minor perceived slights. They've rioted over food, over local policy decisions, over things far less significant than a billionaire blocking out the sun. Burns had, at the moment of the shooting, destroyed the school, the retirement home, and the local bar, injured the town's most beloved pet, and literally darkened the sky. The entire community had assembled, in a state of genuine fury, to confront the man responsible. Multiple characters were visibly armed, and only one shot was fired. One, a single discharge from a single weapon in a crowd of outraged people who had more reason than they'd ever had to act on their anger. Either something unusual happened to make that crowd suddenly, uncharacteristically restrained, or the shooting wasn't as spontaneous as the official story suggests. Maybe the planning was done in advance. Maybe someone arranged to be the one who acted and made sure everyone else's anger burned out in the room. Maybe the person who fired that shot knew exactly what they were doing and had chosen the location, the timing, and the weapon deliberately because they had access to Burns' schedule and his gun and a reason to make sure the right person took the blame. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The show committed to it. The writers have supported it in interviews and commentaries. But the contest nobody won, the clues the victim himself dismissed as coincidental, the alternate endings that were fully produced, Homer's unaddressed confession, and the final shot of Maggie in the empty room, checking that nobody is watching before she mimics the motion of pulling a trigger. All of it creates a picture that is more ambiguous than the official verdict would have you believe. In Springfield, a case being closed and a case being solved are two very different things, and the greatest mystery in the show's history may still be open. Section 4. Mr. Burns and the Immortality Machine. Let's slow things down again. Take a breath. You're doing fine. Let the weight of wherever you're resting pull you down a little more. We've talked about Homer's potential coma. We've talked about the plant and what it might be doing to Springfield's population. We've reopened the Burns shooting. Now let's talk about the man himself, and the single most unsettling fact about his existence, which is that he exists at all. Charles Montgomery Burns is old. The exact number varies depending on which episode you're working from, because the show's floating timeline has allowed different episodes to place his birth year in slightly different locations within the late 19th century. But every version of his timeline, the most conservative reading and the most generous, puts Burns well past 100 years old. Some calculations place him closer to 130, and on the basis of certain references he makes to historical events he claims to have experienced firsthand, the number could theoretically climb higher than that. He didn't just survive to this age. He functions at this age. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal politics, manages relationships with elected officials, orchestrates long-term schemes that require sophisticated planning and a working understanding of contemporary law and finance. His body is frail, yes. His physical strength is genuinely negligible, one of the show's reliable running jokes, but his mind is sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, more capable of deliberate, sustained cognitive effort than almost anyone else the show has introduced in 3.5 decades. And he has been operating at that level for longer than any human being should be capable of sustaining coherent thought. The show addresses his survival directly in the Springfield Files episode we discussed earlier. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment that is so extreme, so saturated with chemical and radiological intervention, that it causes his body to emit visible light. The treatment keeps him functional for exactly 7 days, at which point it needs to be re-administered. Without it, he dies. The margin for error is 0. His survival is maintained the way you maintain a piece of precision machinery, through scheduled servicing, on an exact timetable, with no tolerance for deviation. The treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who built and operates a nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's water and air for decades, is personally sustained by controlled radiation exposure administered through a medical protocol that doesn't appear to exist anywhere in conventional medicine. Burns isn't just profiting from radiation. He is powered by it. His cellular processes have been so fundamentally altered by a century of proximity to nuclear material that they can no longer operate through normal biological function. He requires external radiation input the way most organisms require nutrients. Stop the treatments and his biology collapses within a week. This connects to one of the most memorable and most frequently quoted scenes in the entire series, the moment when Burns visits a doctor who, after conducting a comprehensive examination, informs him that he has every disease known to medical science, every known pathogen, every known degenerative condition, all of them simultaneously present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains it using what he calls Three Stooges syndrome. Burns's diseases are all competing to kill him at once. They're all pressing forward simultaneously, like three people trying to fit through a narrow doorway at the same moment. And because they're all pressing forward at once, none of them can advance. They create a perfect biological deadlock, each illness canceling out the momentum of every other illness. The doctor's conclusion is that Burns is the sickest person in America and, paradoxically, functionally indestructible, because everything trying to kill him is being neutralized by everything else trying to kill him. The show plays this as a joke. It is, on its surface, one of the funnier pieces of world-building the show ever produced. But within the framework of the radiation theory, it describes something genuinely frightening. Burns's body isn't maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural process. The equilibrium is being maintained artificially. The weekly radiation treatments aren't curing his conditions. They're managing them, holding each disease in a state of precisely calibrated stasis, balanced against all the others, preventing any single condition from gaining the advantage it would need to progress. It's not medicine in any conventional sense. It's nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is operating like a reactor that needs constant monitoring to prevent a catastrophic imbalance, and the treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control systems to keep every element in a state of suspended tension. Which means Smithers is not simply a devoted assistant. He is a medical necessity. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures that every appointment, every treatment, every necessary intervention is executed on time and correctly. He monitors Burns's physical condition with an attention that looks, from the outside, like obsession or devotion, but that the show's broader context reveals as something functionally more important than either of those things. Without Smithers tracking the treatment schedule and making sure nothing is missed, Burns would fail to receive a dose. And one missed dose is enough. The show has established this dependency repeatedly across multiple storylines. When Smithers is removed from his role, Burns deteriorates rapidly. When Burns and Smithers' relationship is strained, Burns becomes visibly less stable. The devotion that appears, on the surface, to be a comedic character trait of Smithers's, his almost comically intense loyalty to an employer who treats him poorly, is underpinned by a practical reality that neither character ever explicitly discusses. Smithers knows that if he walks away, Burns dies. And Burns, though he would never acknowledge it, is entirely dependent on this one person to maintain the biological infrastructure that keeps him alive. Burns's connection to history deserves attention here, because it adds a layer to the immortality question that the show never quite resolves. Across the series, Burns has casually referenced personal involvement in events spanning from the early 20th century to the present day. He attended Yale. He served in some capacity during World War II, in a role the show implies was morally compromised at best. He stole $1 trillion bill from the United States government during that war and kept it hidden for decades. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as something he read about, but as something he experienced, and his descriptions of contemporary historical figures are delivered with the familiarity of someone who knew them personally rather than learned about them through books. His family history extends even further back. The Burns dynasty is depicted across multiple episodes as one of the oldest continuously wealthy families in American history. The fortune predates the Industrial Revolution. The family's control over its assets has been described as continuous across generations that would span centuries of American history. This isn't just inherited wealth. This is a lineage that has maintained consistent power for longer than most American institutions have existed, through every economic disruption and political upheaval and technological revolution that the country has experienced. The question the show never quite asks directly is whether Burns is unique in this longevity, or whether his family has always found ways to extend lifespans beyond what normal biology allows. Before nuclear technology existed, before the radiation treatments that currently keep Burns alive were possible, before modern medicine provided any of the tools that his current maintenance protocol relies on, what did the Burns family use? What kept previous generations in power long enough to accumulate the kind of multi-generational control the show describes? The show doesn't answer this, but it establishes enough of the family history to make the question feel relevant. Burns's relationship with death itself is worth examining carefully. He has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show's long run. He was shot by Maggie, or by whoever actually shot him. He has been hospitalized many times. He has collapsed in ways that would be fatal for anyone else. He has been abandoned in wilderness environments without resources. He has been attacked, he has been poisoned, and every time, he comes back. Not through the cartoon invincibility that allows Homer to walk away from being hit by a truck. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through the machinery of wealth, through the system he has spent a century building specifically to ensure that no matter what happens to his physical body, the resources to rebuild it are always available. Homer's survival in the show is passive. The plot needs him to survive, so he does. Burns's survival is engineered. Every relationship he has maintained, every institution he has invested in, every politician he has kept on his payroll, every doctor he has retained, every pharmaceutical development his company has funded, all of it ultimately serves a single purpose. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, his empire requires an heir. And empires don't like requiring heirs. Heirs can be argued with. Heirs can disagree with the direction of the enterprise. Heirs might, if they're particularly principled or particularly foolish, decide to acknowledge what the plant has been doing to Springfield and try to address it. Burns's continuous survival is the most reliable guarantee that none of those complications will arise. Here is the dimension that makes the Burns immortality theory genuinely uncomfortable, though. Springfield needs Burns to stay alive, and not in a metaphorical sense. The town's economy is organized around the power plant. The power plant requires Burns's specific management and his specific approach to non-compliance with regulatory requirements. Without Burns, the plant either closes, gets sold to someone who actually fixes the violations, or gets managed differently, any of which would destabilize the economic foundation that Springfield depends on. The contamination would presumably stop, or at least be addressed, but the economic disruption would be severe. Burns is kept alive by his treatments. His treatments are funded by his fortune. His fortune is generated by the plant. The plant is staffed by people like Homer who are, whether by design or by the effects of long-term radiation exposure, too cognitively impaired to notice what's happening to them. Those people and their families live in Springfield, drink the water, breathe the air, sustain the contamination that warps their biology in ways that make them easier to manage. It's a closed loop, self-sustaining. The man, the machine, the money, and the damaged population all feed each other in a cycle that has been running for decades and shows no sign of breaking. Mr. Burns is the oldest man in Springfield. He might be the oldest man in America. He is kept alive by technology that exists nowhere else in the known world, funded by a fortune built on a century of environmental negligence, maintained by a single devoted assistant whose departure would be a death sentence, and surrounded by a population too damaged to question why their employer glows in the dark and speaks about the Civil War with the tense of someone who was there. He's not immortal, exactly. The theory doesn't quite go that far. He will eventually die, when the treatments fail, or when Smithers finally leaves, or when some cascade of illness breaks through the deadlock, and one of the 300 conditions competing in his body manages to gain the upper hand. But until that day, he is something almost more durable than immortal. He is too expensive to die, and Springfield will keep paying that bill. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper Springfield's Infrastructure of Denial. You can let your breathing slow down. This part of the story is quieter in a way, but it might be the most important part. There is an episode of The Simpsons that is almost universally considered among the worst the show has ever produced. It aired on the 28th of September 1997, the second episode of Season 9. It's called The Principal and the Pauper, and the backlash it generated has never fully subsided, even 28 years later. Critics cite it as the moment the show stopped caring about its own continuity. Fans describe it as a betrayal of everything the series had established. Harry Shearer, the voice actor who plays Principal Skinner among many other characters, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. And the episode is, without question, disruptive. What it does to an established character is abrupt and feels, in the moment, gratuitous. But here's the argument that the show's detractors have never quite addressed. The episode is completely honest about what Springfield is. It takes the show's most consistently hidden mechanism, the machinery that allows a town to function under impossible circumstances, and puts it on screen in explicit, unambiguous detail. It doesn't hide this mechanism inside jokes and background details. It shows you the thing directly. And people hated it, which is itself interesting. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event to honor Principal Skinner, celebrating his 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger arrives. A man nobody recognizes. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam veteran who was captured during the war, believed dead, and has only now returned home after surviving conditions that the show briefly describes but doesn't dwell on. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner for 2 decades is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian, and before Vietnam, he was a petty criminal from a troubled background, the kind of young man with no family, no roots, and no clear future. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt a responsibility he didn't know how to discharge. He traveled to Springfield to tell Skinner's mother that her son was dead. But when he arrived, Agnes Skinner looked at him and assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son, with the particular fierce need of a grieving parent who hasn't quite accepted what they've been told. And Tamzarian, who had never in his life been needed by anyone, who had never had a home or an identity, or a person who looked at him with that kind of desperate recognition, simply went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner, took the name, the backstory, the rank, the life, the difficult relationship with a demanding mother, and he lived inside that borrowed identity for 20 years until the door of the gymnasium opened and the real man walked through it. The town now knows everything. The real Skinner is present. Tamzarian is present. The truth has been laid out fully, without ambiguity, in front of the entire community. And Springfield holds a meeting, not to decide how to prosecute Tamzarian, not to figure out how to restore the real Skinner's identity or compensate him for 2 decades of lost time. The town votes on whether to acknowledge the truth at all, and the verdict is unanimous. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree. The imposter is declared, by law, to be the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war veteran who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life occupied by someone else, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal under penalty of torture to ever mention the events of this episode again. Let that resolution rest in your mind for a moment. A community of people, having been confronted with definitive proof that one of their central institutions has been built on a lie, chose the lie. Not out of affection for Tamzarian specifically, though the episode does suggest genuine community feeling for the man they know. Out of a preference for the narrative they've been living with over the inconvenience of the truth they've just been handed. The truth was expelled from Springfield on a train. The man who represented the truth was expelled alongside it, and it was made a crime to remember. Fans hated this because it felt like the show was casually destroying a character that people had genuinely cared about for 8 seasons. Everything they knew about Skinner was built on a fiction. His military service wasn't his. His relationship with his mother wasn't natural. His entire dynamic with Bart, the antagonist relationship that had generated hundreds of comedic moments across the series, was built on a persona he'd borrowed from a dead man. But here's what the detractors didn't want to acknowledge. The episode is completely honest. Springfield has always done exactly what it does in this episode. The only difference is that this time you watched it happen in real time. Every other instance of Springfield's collective amnesia, every reset between episodes, every catastrophic event that simply isn't mentioned in the episode that follows, happens off-screen. You don't see the mechanism. You don't see the vote, the decree, the deliberate choice to prefer the comfortable lie. You just notice that the consequences of last week's episode don't seem to have carried over, and you write it off as the limitations of episodic storytelling. The Principal and the Pauper is the one occasion where the show let you watch the mechanism operate. It put the camera on the vote. It showed you the legal decree. It showed you the actual, literal expulsion of an inconvenient truth from the community. And because the mechanism was finally visible, people could see how ugly it was. But it was always there. It was operating every week. Springfield has been doing this since season 1. Consider how many events should have permanently altered the town's reality. Springfield has been sealed under a government dome. It has been invaded. It has survived nuclear near misses, environmental catastrophes severe enough to attract federal attention, the literal physical blocking of the sun. It has experienced events that would reshape any real community permanently, that would generate decades of legal proceedings and psychological trauma and political consequence. And by the next episode, or sometimes within the same episode, everything is back to normal. Nobody references what happened. The slate is clean. The coma theory says this is a dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The radiation theory says it's cognitive damage from chronic exposure. Both of those explanations locate the cause inside the characters themselves. But the principal and the pauper offers a third explanation that is, in some ways, the most troubling because it requires no supernatural mechanism. Springfield resets because the town collectively chooses to reset, deliberately, consciously, through an unspoken social contract that has been in operation since long before the show gave you the opportunity to watch it being exercised. The contract says that events which are too destabilizing to the existing order will not be acknowledged. The agreed-upon version of reality will be maintained. Anyone who insists on the truth at the expense of this agreement will be removed. This is not unique to cartoons. Small communities in the real world have a well-documented capacity for exactly this kind of collective denial. Scandals get buried not through any formal conspiracy, but through a distributed, organic process by which everyone with a stake in the existing order quietly agrees not to mention the uncomfortable thing and applies social pressure to anyone who tries to. The truth doesn't get hidden through any dramatic cover-up. It gets buried under the accumulated weight of everyone looking slightly to one side every time it comes up. Springfield has been doing this for decades. The episode just showed you the mechanism with the filters off, and if you follow the chain that the episode implies, the logic becomes even more suffocating. If Springfield's population acknowledges the dome, they have to acknowledge the pollution that caused it. If they acknowledge the pollution, they have to confront the plant. If they confront the plant, they have to challenge Burns. If they challenge Burns, the economy that everyone in town depends on becomes unstable. If the economy becomes unstable, the town as a functioning community is at risk. So they don't acknowledge the dome. They don't mention the pollution. They don't challenge the plant. They maintain the agreement, episode after episode, season after season, keeping the loop closed and the truth safely out of circulation. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's most recent cautionary example. He arrived with proof. He presented his evidence. He represented a truth that was genuinely, verifiably correct, and the community's response was to tie him to a train. That is what Springfield does to the truth. And if Homer is dreaming, the principal and the pauper takes on an additional meaning that is quietly devastating. Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire community votes to sustain a comfortable lie rather than confront a destabilizing truth. He dreamed a town that made honesty illegal and expelled the honest man. And maybe that's the version of the world a comatose brain needs to believe in. If lies can become legally real through collective agreement, then Homer's dream isn't a delusion. It's a community consensus. He's not lying in a hospital bed inventing a life he isn't living. He's dreaming a dream that Springfield has officially voted to recognize as reality. As long as nobody questions it, the dream continues. Springfield is not an eccentric cartoon town in a perpetual present tense. Springfield is a community with a very specific, very deliberate relationship to truth. It keeps the truths that serve it and expels the ones that don't. It maintains a version of reality that allows the existing power structure to continue operating undisturbed. And anyone who challenges that version of reality, whether they're a war veteran with evidence of an imposter, a three-eyed fish in a river near a nuclear plant, or a federal agency arriving with a dome, gets dealt with accordingly. The Principal and the Pauper isn't the worst episode of The Simpsons. It might be the most important one, because it is the only episode that shows you, without softening, what Springfield actually is beneath the jokes and the familiar characters and the comfortable rhythms of a show you've been watching your whole life. It is a town that made honesty a crime, and the last honest man is somewhere out there on a train, heading away from the only home he ever had, which was never actually his to begin with. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the most powerful person in Springfield. Settle in a little further. Let your thoughts soften. Because this section is about the quietest member of the Simpson family, and the case that she may be the most capable one. Maggie Simpson doesn't talk. She communicates through pacifier sounds and the occasional carefully considered facial expression. She can't walk reliably, spending most of her time either being carried or crawling or taking a few uncertain steps before toppling over. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. In the hierarchy of the Simpson family, she occupies the lowest visible rung. The baby, the one who gets carried and fed and placed in the corner while the real drama of the household plays out around her. And in those 36 years of not talking and not walking, Without saying a word that anyone could easily attribute to conscious intent, Maggie has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot the richest man in Springfield. She led a successful, organized rebellion against a tyrannical daycare administrator. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations using problem-solving abilities that the show implies are extraordinary, even by adult standards. She was tested on at least one occasion and found to possess intelligence that standardized evaluation couldn't quite accommodate. And through every one of these moments, every demonstration of capability beyond anything a one-year-old should possess, she maintained her silence and returned to her pacifier and allowed everyone around her to go back to treating her like a baby. Let's start with the shooting, though as the theory develops, it becomes clear that the shooting is actually the least remarkable thing about her. We've already examined the evidence and the holes in the official resolution. We've considered the possibility that the final shot of Maggie in the empty room, checking her surroundings before mimicking the motion of pulling a trigger, might be something other than a comic confirmation of guilt. What's worth examining now is the aftermath. A baby was identified as the person who shot the most powerful man in Springfield. The police investigated. DNA evidence was analyzed. The victim identified his assailant from his hospital bed. And the official conclusion was that yes, this infant did this, and there is nothing to be done about it because a baby cannot be prosecuted. The case was closed. The shooter was identified and immediately protected from any consequence by virtue of being too young to have consequences applied to her. Now look at what Maggie does in the final shot of that episode. Everyone else has left the room. Maggie looks around. She confirms nobody is watching with what can only be described as deliberate situational awareness. Then she moves her pacifier in a specific, intentional motion that mimics the act of pulling a trigger. She performs this gesture in private, after checking her surroundings, and then returns to normal. That sequence requires several things that one-year-olds are not neurologically equipped to demonstrate. It requires the retention of a specific memory of a specific event. It requires the recognition that performing this particular gesture in front of an audience would have social consequences, and the corresponding decision not to do so in front of an audience. It requires the impulse to recreate the memory privately when the social risk has passed. And it requires the sophisticated enough awareness of context to know when the coast is clear. Babies imitate. That's well documented. But babies imitate indiscriminately. They don't wait until they're alone. They don't scan the room before performing an imitation. The decision to reproduce a specific behavior in private while suppressing it in public is the decision of someone who understands social observation and its implications, and has chosen, consciously and strategically, to manage what information about herself is available to others. That is not developmental behavior, that is strategy. The Longest Daycare is a short animated film released in 2012, screened before Ice Age, Continental Drift in cinemas, and nominated for an Academy Award. It is 7 minutes long, and it is, within those 7 minutes, the most concentrated and explicit demonstration of Maggie's cognitive ability that the franchise has ever produced. No dialogue. No other Simpson family members. Just Maggie in a daycare environment, encountering a challenge and solving it. The challenge is a caterpillar about to become a butterfly that a bully in the facility is trying to destroy. The solution requires Maggie to understand the layout of a building she's never been in before, identify the relevant threat actors and their likely behavior patterns, develop a strategy for protecting the caterpillar against both the bully and the institutional constraints of the daycare, adapt that strategy in real time as circumstances change, execute multi-step plans that require precise timing and spatial awareness, and predict other people's behavior accurately enough to plan around it. She does all of this without speaking a word, limited to the physical capabilities of a one-year-old body that keeps falling over. Her body struggles with every basic motor task the plan requires. But every decision she makes is correct. Every adaptation is optimal. Every prediction about how the other characters will behave turns out to be accurate. Her intelligence compensates for every limitation her physical development imposes, and she wins. The butterfly is protected. The bully is thwarted. The daycare returns to normal, and nobody who works there appears to have noticed what happened. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence in various ways across multiple episodes, and the results, while they vary, point consistently in the same direction. Maggie is not a normal baby. Her cognitive function is operating at a level that the show's internal logic cannot easily categorize. The moments where this is tested directly are played for comedy and quickly set aside, but the accumulation of these moments creates an unmistakable pattern. And then there's the silence itself. Maggie's first word was daddy, delivered in a cameo appearance by Elizabeth Taylor in a season 4 episode. It happened once. It was never repeated. For 36 years since that moment, Maggie has existed in the family without developing language in any meaningful way. This is treated as a characterization choice, a running bit, the baby who doesn't talk because babies don't talk and Maggie is the baby. But look at who surrounds her. Homer talks constantly. Marge talks constantly, often using language to process worry and anxiety in real time. Bart talks constantly, provoking and challenging and filling every available space with noise. Lisa talks constantly, lecturing and observing and questioning and advocating. The Simpson household is perhaps the most verbally dense environment imaginable for a developing child. Maggie is surrounded by continuous language from the moment she's born, exposed to an uninterrupted river of words and communication and expressive behavior. And she says nothing. Look at what happened to Lisa Simpson as a result of being visibly intelligent. Lisa is brilliant. The show establishes this across hundreds of episodes. Her IQ is multiple times higher than the Springfield average. Her analytical capabilities, her empathy, her artistic sensibility, her ethical instincts, all operate at a level that should make her the most respected and most influential person in her family and her school. Instead, she is isolated. She is mocked. She is dismissed. She raises concerns that are ignored. She challenges institutions and gets punished. She tries to improve her community and finds the community resistant to improvement. Her intelligence is her most defining characteristic, and it has made her life harder in almost every measurable way. Being the smartest person in a room that doesn't want to think about what that means is not an advantage in Springfield. Maggie watched this. From her corner, from her crib, from the back seat of the car and the corner of the family living room and the floor of the kitchen, she watched her sister demonstrate exceptional intelligence and be consistently, systematically undervalued for it. She watched what happened to visible capability in this household and this community, and she learned the opposite lesson from the one Lisa learned. Lisa learned to keep fighting regardless of the cost, to advocate louder when ignored, to press harder when pushed back, to refuse to dim herself even when dimming would make things easier. Maggie watched this and concluded that it wasn't the strategy that served her best interests. Not in Springfield, not in a household already organized around managing Homer's chaos and Bart's disruption and Marge's anxiety. The theory suggests that Maggie's silence is not developmental delay. It is a strategic decision, a choice made by a mind intelligent enough to understand that being underestimated is a resource, that invisibility is armor, that the less attention you draw, the more freedom you have to operate. And it works. Every remarkable thing Maggie has ever done, she has done below the radar. The shooting went uninvestigated as a crime, partly because nobody could seriously process a baby as a shooter. The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody monitors infants closely enough to see them organizing. Her IQ test results are noted and then set aside because the adults around her don't know what to do with the information and return, by default, to treating her as a baby. Every display of capability happens in the spaces where nobody is paying sufficient attention, and Maggie has cultivated those spaces carefully by being, to all external appearances, exactly what everyone expects a baby to be: quiet, passive, dependent, manageable. She is none of those things. Now connect this to the radiation theory. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces mutations that express differently in different individuals, Maggie and Homer represent the two poles of what radiation exposure can do to human biology. Homer's mutation diminished his cognitive function to the point of clinical disability. Maggie's mutation, in the theory's framework, amplified hers to a level that the show's standardized testing genuinely couldn't measure. Same environment, same water supply, same irradiated air, opposite cognitive outcomes, separated by one generation, and whatever biological variables determine how a given organism responds to long-term nuclear exposure. Homer and Maggie are, under this reading, two sides of the same radioactive coin. He represents what contamination takes away. She represents what it can, in the right circumstances, give. If the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius acquires a different kind of weight. If Homer is dreaming, and every episode is the product of an unconscious mind trying to hold on to his family in the only way it still can, Then Maggie's extraordinary capability is Homer's deepest wish for his youngest child projected into the dream. He can't see her grow up. He can't watch her learn to walk and talk and develop into the person she's going to become. He's lying in a hospital bed and that future is happening without him, somewhere beyond the dream's boundary. So in the dream, she is already extraordinary, already capable of things no baby should be able to do, already fine, already equipped to handle a world without him in it. Her genius, under the coma reading, isn't a mutation, it's a prayer. But back in Springfield, if there is a waking Springfield, the darker reading is simpler and maybe more honest. Maggie doesn't speak because she has watched what speaking gets you in this town. She doesn't reveal her intelligence because intelligence, visible and loud, is what gets you dismissed and isolated and undervalued. She watches everything. She remembers everything. She processes everything with a depth and precision that nobody around her suspects, because nobody around her is looking closely enough to notice. And she waits. The show never tells us what Maggie is waiting for. Her endgame is the last genuinely open question in the Simpson family story. We've seen glimpses of capability. We've seen her exercise judgment and demonstrate situational awareness and solve problems that the adults around her couldn't solve. We've seen the family, in certain moments, trust her assessment of a situation over their own. But we haven't seen the thing she's building toward. 1-year-old. 36 years. The most capable member of the Simpson family, hiding behind a pacifier, waiting behind enormous eyes, in perfect silence. When she finally decides to act, Springfield won't see it coming. That's exactly how she designed it. Section 7. Mona Simpson. The cover-up that built Homer's life. Let everything around you get quieter. The story we're getting to now is the one that runs beneath all the others. The one that, when you find it, makes you understand Homer Simpson in a way that nothing else quite does. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the established fact. Abe Simpson had told Homer his mother died when he was young. There was a grave. Homer had mourned. He had grown up carrying the specific, heavy grief of a boy who lost his mother in childhood and had to make his way without her. This loss shaped him. His need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his compulsive clinginess toward Marge, his willingness to endure humiliation and mistreatment from his employer rather than risk losing the stability his family provided. Homer's entire emotional architecture was built around the wound left by a mother who, as far as he knew, was simply gone. In Season 7, the show revealed that the wound was built on a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired on the 19th of November, 1995, and it is widely considered one of the finest episodes in the entire series. The setup is almost incidental. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday. He ends up at the Hall of Records to correct the administrative error this creates, and there, in a municipal database, he finds something that rearranges his understanding of his entire life. His mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him was real, but it belonged to a poet named Walt Whitman. Abe had been presenting a famous writer's headstone as his wife's burial site for the entirety of Homer's childhood and adult life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery visiting what she believes is her dead son's grave. They recognize each other slowly, with the particular disoriented tenderness of two people encountering someone they thought was permanently gone. And then Mona tells him the truth. She didn't abandon him because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have put him in danger. Because the man who owned the nuclear power plant, the man Homer would spend his entire adult life working for, had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife in Springfield. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. By any external measure, she was living an unremarkable domestic life, the kind that defined millions of American women during a period when the world outside was in extraordinary turbulence. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the counterculture pressing against every established institution, and somewhere along the way, something shifted for Mona. She was radicalized, not in the caricature sense, but in the very human sense of a person who started paying attention and couldn't go back to not paying attention afterward. She joined a group of activists, and their target was specific: a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Not just a nuclear plant with safety violations, a facility designed to produce biological weapons. Pathogen development in a facility located in the same community where Homer was growing up. where families were living their ordinary lives, where children were playing in streets that were downwind from a building manufacturing weaponized disease agents. Mona and her group broke in. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored inside. During the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid was successful. The weapons were destroyed. But in the chaos of the group fleeing the facility, Mona made one mistake. Someone had been knocked down. She stopped to help them. And the person she stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't call her family. She couldn't hold her son or explain to him, in words he could understand, why she was disappearing. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and walked out of his life. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 27 years believing he was the kind of person a mother would rather leave than raise. That there was something fundamentally unlovable about him that made the people who were supposed to stay the most likely to go. That the absence at the center of his life was his fault, in some way he couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply every day. This belief shaped everything. The desperate need to be liked. The inability to function without Marge's support and approval. The clinging, sometimes suffocating devotion to his family that coexists, paradoxically, with the constant self-destructive behavior that puts that family at risk. Homer loves his family with an intensity that occasionally looks pathological because, on some level he was never quite conscious of, he always expected them to disappear. And now here's where the theory deepens from a personal tragedy into something structural. When Mona returns to Springfield in Season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a window. He calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to stand in his driveway and watch his mother get into a car and drive away for the second time, and this time he knows why. He knows the shape of what was done to his family. He knows who did it. And he goes back to work on Monday. He goes back to the plant. He clocks in at the facility owned by the man who destroyed his family. He sits at his workstation and sleeps through meltdown warnings, and eats donuts, and fumbles through another shift at the job he's been failing at for his entire career. And he doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't quit. He doesn't even seem to fully connect the employer, who can't remember his name, with the billionaire who spent decades pursuing his mother across the country to prevent her from coming home to him. The show doesn't play this as comedy. It plays it as tragedy. Homer is too damaged to make the connection with the cognitive clarity it would require. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of environmental contamination, all of it has worked together to create a man who can hold two facts in his mind simultaneously and never quite manage to examine what they mean when placed next to each other. The man who signs Homer's paychecks is the man who took Homer's mother. And Homer can't reach that conclusion because Homer's brain doesn't work that way anymore. And it doesn't work that way, at least in part, because of what the man who signs his paychecks has been doing to Springfield's water supply for 30 years. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life. He engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was 6 years old, Burns ensured that Homer would develop into a specific kind of person. Emotionally fragile, desperate for approval, incapable of functioning without external validation, terrified of abandonment in ways that made him willing to endure almost any treatment from an employer rather than risk losing his job, because his job was the financial foundation of the family, and the family was the only thing standing between Homer and the specific loneliness that had been chasing him since childhood. Burns needed a safety inspector who would not inspect. He found one in the man he'd already broken. The show confirms the deliberate nature of this arrangement across multiple episodes. It's revealed at a certain point that Grandpa Simpson struck a deal with Burns at some earlier juncture. Burns had committed a crime, and Grandpa had discovered it. In exchange for silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would have permanent, unchallengeable employment at the plant, regardless of his performance. 742 documented errors, more near misses and actual incidents than any other employee in the facility's history. And Homer was never let go, because the deal protected him. Homer's job security wasn't a cartoon convenience. It was a contractual obligation brokered between his father and his mother's persecutor. A deal made in the dark that nobody ever explained to Homer, because explaining it would have required explaining everything else that came before it. The architecture of Homer's life, when you see it whole, is one of the most bleak things the show has ever constructed. His mother was a radical who fought against a billionaire's biological weapons program and lost everything. That billionaire spent decades maintaining the conditions that kept Homer broken and compliant. Homer's father covered up the truth and made a deal with the man responsible. Homer inherited all the consequences and none of the context, and spent his entire adult life failing to see the thing that was happening to him because the very cognitive damage that made him a useful pawn made him incapable of noticing the game. 3 generations of Simpsons shaped by one man's grudge. Mona Simpson died in a later season. Homer sat beside her, held her hand. The show didn't use the moment for comedy. It didn't cut away. It let the scene breathe, let the weight of 27 stolen years settle over both of them, and then it let her go. Burns won. He wins. He always wins. Because in Springfield, the man who controls the power controls everything, and the people who might challenge him are too damaged, too compromised, too thoroughly managed to mount a real resistance. Mona fought and was exiled for 30 years. Abe made a deal with the enemy. Homer inherited the resulting brokenness and went to work every morning at the facility that produced it. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has been a comedy for 36 seasons. It is full of jokes and slapstick and wordplay, and the particular warm absurdity that has made it the most beloved animated series ever produced. But underneath the comedy, running through every season and every story and every yellow face in that impossible town, there is a story about what happens to ordinary people when they live inside a system designed to prevent them from ever understanding the system they're living inside. Mona understood it briefly and was punished. Homer almost understood it once, when the crayon came out and the fog cleared and he could see Springfield from the outside for one terrifying, lucid moment. And then he put the crayon back. Not because he was stupid, because the truth was unbearable. And the town that made the truth unbearable is still running, still powered by the same plant, still managed by the same ancient billionaire who glows in the dark and doesn't remember anyone's name, while Homer Simpson goes to work every day in a building owned by the man who stole his childhood. That's the cover-up the show never quite named. It's the one hiding in the most ordinary thing imaginable: a job, a paycheck. A man going to work every morning and coming home every evening and sitting on his couch and watching television and never quite figuring out why his life feels the way it does. Section 8. The predictions. What the show actually knew. You can close your eyes now if you want. This section is about pattern recognition, and the story it tells is interesting whether you're watching closely or just letting the words drift past you. The Simpsons predictions have become, in the 2020s, something the show is almost more famous for than its actual content. Every few months, a new viral clip circulates, showing a moment from a Season 4 or Season 8 or Season 11 episode that appears to have anticipated something that later happened in the real world. The internet encounters this clip and produces a specific, predictable response: astonishment, suspicion, and the question that always follows: how did they know? Let's get the famous ones out of the way first. In the year 2000, the episode Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. In the same episode, she references the economic damage left by her predecessor, who is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 presidential election. When Trump's victory was announced, screenshots from that episode spread across the internet with extraordinary speed. People who hadn't thought about The Simpsons in years were suddenly sharing clips and asking the question: The Simpsons predicted Trump. How? The list extends in multiple directions from there. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a wristwatch that communicates and displays information, something that closely resembles what a modern smartwatch does. In 1998, Homer worked through a mathematical equation on a chalkboard that a physics professor later noted bore a resemblance to work done toward predicting the mass of the Higgs boson particle, a finding that wouldn't be experimentally confirmed until 2012. In 1999, Homer proposed that the universe might be shaped like a donut, and years later, cosmologists found radiation patterns that led some researchers to suggest the universe might have a toroidal structure. In 1993, an episode called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating from Asia that spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply shortages, and a frantic search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. During the fictional outbreak in the episode, the panicking townspeople accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which felt eerily relevant when Asian giant hornets, dramatically nicknamed murder hornets by the media, showed up in the United States during the actual pandemic of 2020. In 1996, a joke was included, in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra while in an altered state. In 2024, 28 years after the episode aired, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. In 1998, the show depicted a media conglomerate swallowing a smaller entertainment company in a storyline that closely mirrored the Disney acquisition of 20th Century Fox, which happened in 2019. In various episodes across the series, the show depicted video calling technology, autocorrect failures, and surveillance culture years before those things became part of everyday life. The list is long. Every time a new entry appears, the question comes back: how did they know? The official answer, delivered by the show's creators with a directness that suggests they've had to give it many times, is that they didn't. Al Jean, the executive producer who has been central to the show's operation since its earliest seasons, addressed the prediction phenomenon with a specific bluntness. He said, roughly, that if you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, put it another way: there are very few cases where The Simpsons actually predicted something, he said. It's mostly coincidence, because the episodes are so old that history repeats itself. That's the official position: coincidence, volume, and the cyclical nature of human events. Fact-checking organizations have examined many of the most widely circulated claims and found explanations that are considerably more mundane than they appear. The Trump episode didn't anticipate something unforeseen. It extrapolated from something that was already visible. Trump had been publicly flirting with presidential runs since the late 1980s. He was a constant presence in American celebrity culture, someone who had been positioning himself as a political figure in various ways for decades before the 2016 election. The episode observed a trend that was already in motion and pushed it to its logical extreme. That's satire, not prophecy. The Disney acquisition wasn't a prediction either. Media consolidation was accelerating throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and the direction it was heading was visible to anyone paying close attention to the entertainment industry. The show observed the trend and wrote a joke about where it leads. When the joke's premise materialized in 2019, it felt like prescience, because the confirmation bias of memory had retained the joke and forgotten the 50 other media consolidation jokes from the same period that didn't come true in the same specific way. The Simpsons writing staff is and has historically been composed of extremely well-educated people. Multiple writers across the show's history have held degrees from elite institutions in fields including mathematics, computer science, political science, and literature. They are not random observers pulling guesses out of the air. They are trained, rigorous analysts of American culture who spend their professional lives examining the trends and systems shaping contemporary life, then extrapolating those trends to their satirical conclusions. When they wrote jokes about the direction of technology in 1995, they were drawing on genuine expertise about where technology was heading. When they wrote political satire in the 2000s, they were working from deep familiarity with political systems and their tendency to produce specific kinds of outcomes under specific kinds of pressure. They weren't predicting the future. They were reading the present more carefully than most people do, then following the lines forward. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the debunking explains most of the predictions without quite explaining all of them. Some of the coincidences are specific in ways that pure trend extrapolation doesn't easily account for. The Trump episode didn't just suggest that a celebrity might eventually run for president. It named Trump specifically, and it depicted something that visually mirrors the specific way Trump announced his candidacy in 2015, descending an escalator. The episode about Siegfried and Roy didn't just joke generally about the danger of exotic animal performances. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers, which closely matched the 2003 incident in which Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers. These aren't broad extrapolations, these are specific details. For those, the most honest answer is that specific coincidences accumulate naturally when you produce 800 episodes of satirical content about American life. The more content you produce, the more opportunities there are for one detail in one episode to line up with one detail in a future event. It's not supernatural. It's not conspiratorial. It's the mathematics of a large enough sample. But the meta-theory deserves attention because it's more interesting than either pure coincidence or anything resembling actual prophecy. The Simpsons doesn't predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it. Not through magic, not through any mechanism that requires suspending disbelief. Through cultural influence, which is a real and well-documented phenomenon with real and measurable effects on how large populations understand and respond to events. The show has been running for 36 years. It has been seen by billions of people across every country with television access. Its jokes, its characters, its observations about American life have been absorbed into the cultural vocabulary at a depth that is difficult to overstate. When The Simpsons makes a joke about a Trump presidency in the year 2000, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream of everyone who watches it. Millions of people see it, they remember it. It becomes a reference point, something people bring up in conversations, something that floats in the background of cultural memory. And because it exists in cultural memory, when Trump begins his actual political rise 15 years later, the joke has already pre-processed that event for millions of people. It's already familiar. It already has a comedic frame around it. The Simpsons already did this. The Simpsons already made this into a punchline. What that does, subtly, is change the cultural relationship to the event itself. Something that has already been joked about feels less shocking than something that arrives without precedent. The Simpsons didn't predict that Trump would become president. The Simpsons made the concept of a Trump presidency feel like a logical, even inevitable extension of existing cultural trends, and in doing so may have contributed, in a small but real way, to the cultural conditions that made it easier to accept when it happened. Springfield doesn't reflect America. The theory suggests that, at some point over the course of 36 years, the relationship reversed. America started reflecting Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 3.5 decades. The nuclear plant on the hill, the corrupt billionaire who can't be held accountable, the government institutions that look functional from the outside and are hopelessly compromised within. The population too distracted by immediate concerns to notice how thoroughly the system has been arranged against them. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset, the institutional amnesia that allows the same mistakes to produce the same outcomes decade after decade. Springfield wasn't predicting where America was heading. Springfield was diagnosing where America already was. The show just put it in writing first. And here is the last piece of the prediction phenomenon that deserves honest acknowledgement. The Simpsons has also made predictions that didn't come true. Many predictions. Hundreds of predictions, probably. Jetpacks and moon colonies and specific political outcomes that went the other way, and cultural developments that never materialized. Nobody makes viral compilations of those. Nobody shares clips of the Simpsons joke that didn't land on the future. Confirmation bias only works in one direction. We remember the hits and allow the misses to quietly disappear. When you produce 800 episodes of satirical content about the trajectory of American life, and then filter all of that content through the most powerful confirmation bias engine in human history, which is the internet's collective memory and its tendency to surface and amplify the moments that resonate while letting everything else drift, you end up with a highlight reel that looks like prophecy but is actually the residue of extraordinary volume passed through an extraordinary filter. The predictions aren't supernatural. They aren't the product of some hidden knowledge. They're what happens when a brilliantly written show, staffed by some of the most analytically rigorous writers in television history, runs long enough and produces enough content that the laws of probability start delivering results that look, in retrospect, like something more than probability. The Simpsons didn't write the future. It wrote enough possible futures that some of them were bound to become the present, and the internet remembered only those. But try explaining that the next time a clip from 1997 lines up with a headline from this year, because even knowing how the trick works, even understanding the mechanism completely, it's still a little unsettling to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations, and enough bullseyes to make even the people who made the show pause, just for a moment, and wonder. Section 9. Where is Springfield, the town that cannot be found? The light can be dim right now. You don't need anything bright for this part. This is a mystery without a location, and that's exactly the point. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people could sketch its general geography from memory: the power plant on the hill, the elementary school, Moe's Tavern, the Quick E-Mart, the gorge that Bart jumps at least twice, the tire fire that has been burning since anyone can remember, than could accurately describe the geography of most real American cities. Springfield has a nuclear power plant, and a harbor, and a mountain range, and desert terrain, and a ski slope, and an active volcano. It borders the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you're in. It has appeared to be both coastal and landlocked, both in the industrial Midwest and in the Pacific Northwest, both in the Deep South and near the Canadian border. Springfield exists everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, and this has been true for 36 years, deliberately, carefully, with the creative team going out of their way to add new contradictory geographic details whenever the existing ones get too close to painting an actual picture. Matt Groening, the show's creator, did confess in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine that he named Springfield after Springfield, Oregon. He said he chose it because it's one of the most common city names in America, and because he grew up near a Springfield and thought the familiarity of the name would help the town feel like somewhere people already knew. For approximately 48 hours, the internet treated this as a resolution. Springfield was in Oregon. Mystery solved, case closed. Then the show continued to contradict this. Episodes aired after the interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts completely inconsistent with Oregon. The writers didn't honor Groening's confession. They kept the mystery alive, because the writers understood something that Groening's interview didn't change. The mystery was the point. The show has built a 36-year history of teasing geographic answers and then snatching them away. Lisa's area code has been shown as 636, which is a Missouri code. The state abbreviation at one point appeared as NT, which doesn't correspond to any real American state. A voice on the phone once identified the state as beginning with a vowel. An episode listed Springfield as being in northern Kentucky, but when that episode went into syndication, a different state was substituted in reruns. The answer literally changes depending on which version of the episode you're watching. The surface explanation is the one the creators have given explicitly. Springfield is designed to feel like somewhere. Not a specific place, but the feeling of a place. The small town or mid-sized city that exists in the background of American life, the kind of community that most people either grew up in or pass through or carry in their imagination as the template for what American domesticity looks like. By keeping Springfield's location unspecified, the show can be set everywhere. It can absorb geographic and cultural details from any region of the country and feel, to viewers in any part of the country, like a town that could theoretically be just outside their window. This is the intentional design, and it works. People from Maine and people from Texas and people from Oregon and people from Georgia all watch The Simpsons and feel the recognizable specificity of Springfield, even though it shares characteristics with all of their places and precisely matches none of them. But under the lens of the theories we've been examining, the geographic impossibility of Springfield becomes something more interesting. If the radiation theory is correct, if Springfield is a contamination zone where the laws of biology have been warped by decades of nuclear exposure until the population's physical characteristics no longer conform to what normal human biology produces, then why should the town's geography be exempt? If the people of Springfield can have 4 fingers and yellow skin and survive trauma that would kill any normal person, if their fish have 3 eyes and their dogs share their owner's physical abnormalities, why should the land itself follow the normal rules of American geography? Maybe the contamination doesn't stop at biological systems. Maybe it extends to the physical landscape. Maybe whatever has happened to the space around Springfield over the decades has compressed geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region. The mountain range and the coastline and the desert and the farmland all coexist within driving distance because the contamination has warped the space between them. If the coma theory is correct, the geographic impossibility is explained even more simply. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't contain a precise map of the United States. It contains impressions. Fragments of places seen and visited and absorbed from television and conversation. Mountains from a childhood vacation. An ocean from a commercial he watched. Desert terrain from a movie. Midwestern farmland from a drive he took once. The dreaming mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape Homer ever encountered, layered over each other without regard for geographic logic, Because dreams don't have geographic logic. Dreams have emotional logic. And Springfield feels like America because it was built from Homer's emotional memory of America, scattered and incomplete, and held together by longing rather than cartography. If the principle and the pauper theory is correct, if Springfield is a community defined by the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, the geographic ambiguity serves a specific institutional purpose. You can't hold anyone accountable for what happens in a town you can't find. You can't investigate a facility if the jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. You can't serve a regulatory notice on a power plant if the state it's in keeps changing. You can't bring charges under any state's law if the state itself is subject to revision depending on which episode you're watching. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means a specific state attorney general can open a specific file on Burns's specific facility. Landing means the EPA can maintain consistent oversight rather than having to reestablish jurisdiction every time the show contradicts the previous geographic information. Landing means someone with a map and a badge can show up and start asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the human skeletons in the basement and the safety inspector who sleeps at his workstation. Floating means none of that can happen. Springfield's geographic impossibility is not an oversight or a running joke about the difficulty of maintaining continuity across a 36-year run. It's a legal strategy, the most comprehensive regulatory shield in the history of fictional environmental negligence. The town exists everywhere, so no specific authority can claim it. Burns operates in a jurisdiction that cannot be defined, under laws that cannot be consistently specified, in a state that changes depending on the broadcast platform. He is, in the most literal possible sense, beyond the reach of any accountability mechanism that depends on geography to function. And every viewer who has ever wondered, in a casual way, where Springfield actually is, has encountered the edge of this structure and retreated without quite realizing what they ran into. Springfield will never be located. Not because the show can't decide, because the show decided, long ago, that Springfield is more useful as a mystery than as an answer. A town that cannot be found is a town that cannot be held. A town that belongs to everywhere belongs to nowhere that matters for regulatory purposes. And the people inside it, yellow-skinned and four-fingered and drinking contaminated water in a community that floats outside any legal framework, keep living their impossible, unchanging, beautifully ordinary lives in the most comprehensively protected location in the history of American television. Section 10. The floating timeline: why nobody ages and what that means. This is the last big mystery. The one that connects all the others. The one that, when you stop treating it as a cartoon convention and start treating it as evidence, stops being a production decision and starts being a statement. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then and is 8 now. Homer and Marge were somewhere in their mid-30s at the show's debut and remain there today. Maggie has been 1 year old since before most of her current viewers were born. 36 years have passed in the world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The technical term for this is a floating timeline, and it is a production convention that most long-running animated series employ in some form. The present of the show is always the viewer's present. The year changes. The cultural references change. The technology and the background updates, the episodes reference contemporary events, but the characters themselves remain at a fixed age, frozen at the moment the show began, living through decades of cultural change without accumulating any of the time those decades represent. Every other animated series with a long run uses some version of this, and most viewers extend it a natural courtesy. Of course, The Simpsons don't age. It's a cartoon. Cartoons don't age. Move on. The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has started doing something cartoons don't usually live long enough to do. It has created contradictions too large and too visible to paper over with production convention explanations. The most structurally significant of these is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their history was set in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. They fell in love to era-appropriate music. Homer had a specific hairdo from a specific decade. Marge wore a specific dress to a specific prom. The whole courtship was anchored to a time period that made natural sense for parents in their mid-30s during the late 1980s. The anchor held for several seasons because the gap between the established backstory and the show's present wasn't large enough to create visible problems. But the floating timeline dragged the present forward, and as the years passed, the backstory's anchor started to strain. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they didn't meet in 1980. They would have met sometime around 2005, which means their high school years weren't defined by disco and the aftermath of Watergate. They were defined by MySpace and early YouTube and the cultural landscape of the early 2000s. The show has acknowledged this by rewriting the backstory. In later flashback episodes, Homer and Marge's youth has been repositioned in different decades. They've been depicted as grunge-era kids, then as millennial teenagers, with each revision sliding their formative years forward to remain consistent with the floating present. This means Homer and Marge don't have a fixed past. Their memories are revisable. Their origin story gets redrafted every few years to maintain the illusion of characters who exist in the present tense without being burdened by an increasingly historical past. Their history is not what happened to them. Their history is the current best approximation of what would need to have happened to them for them to be the ages they are right now. Apply the theories to this, and something remarkable happens. Every single theory we've worked through in this video arrives at the same conclusion through a different path. The radiation theory says the characters don't age because their biology has been altered at the cellular level by decades of contamination, and whatever that alteration has done to their physical selves includes somehow interrupting the normal progression of cellular aging. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went unconscious in April 1993 and whose unconscious brain cannot imagine his children growing up because he wasn't there to see it happen. The principal and the pauper theory says nobody ages because Springfield collectively agrees to ignore any truth that threatens the status quo, and the truth that time has passed and the characters should be older is exactly the kind of destabilizing truth the town cannot afford to acknowledge. The Burns immortality theory says at least one person in Springfield has already established that aging is negotiable given sufficient resources, which means the concept of time's effect on biology is already understood in this universe to be contingent rather than absolute. 4 different theories. 4 different explanatory mechanisms. 1 shared conclusion. Time doesn't work in Springfield. Something has broken the normal flow of time for everyone who lives in this town, and whatever broke it has been breaking it since at least 1989. The show has imagined its characters aging. It's done this in specific episodes that are among the most beloved the show has ever produced. In Lisa's Wedding from season 6, the show flashes forward to show Lisa as a 23-year-old woman, engaged, living a life that is clearly and unmistakably the life she was always heading toward. She's brilliant and principled and slightly lonely and searching for connection in a world that still doesn't quite know how to handle her. The episode proves that the show's writers understand exactly who these characters would become if time were allowed to operate normally. They can see the futures. They can imagine the grown-up versions of these children. They can build an entire episode around who Lisa would be at 23 and make it feel completely, emotionally true. And then they send her back. The flash-forward closes. Lisa returns to being 8. The imagined future gets sealed away and the permanent present resumes. The glimpse through the window closes, and nothing on the other side of it changes anything about the side you're standing on. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And this refusal, the theory suggests, is not a limitation of the medium or a practical production decision. It is a statement, a specific, considered statement about something larger than a 36-year animated series. The Simpsons is, and has been for 3.5 decades, the American family, not a American family. The American family in the way that symbolic representations become the thing they represent through sheer repetition and cultural saturation. More people have watched Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie than have watched any other fictional family in the history of the medium. Their specific dynamic, the lovably imperfect father, the patient and quietly fierce mother, the rebellious son, the brilliantly isolated daughter, the mysterious baby, has been absorbed into the cultural vocabulary at a depth that makes them feel less like fictional characters and more like archetypes, prototypes for roles that real families recognize as their own. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement about what this family means. Homer must always be middle-aged because Homer is the American father, And the American father is the thing that is always in his mid-30s, always beleaguered, always imperfect, always somehow surviving. Marge must always be patient because the American mother is defined in this version of the family by her patience and her fierce protective love, and her capacity to hold everything together when nothing else will. Bart must always be rebellious because the American son is the one who pushes against the order, who questions everything, who sometimes makes things worse in the process of making them interesting. Lisa must always be idealistic because the American daughter is the one who still believes the world can be better than it is. Maggie must always be silent and mysterious because every American family has something they haven't said yet, something they're waiting for the right moment to articulate. If these characters age, if Bart goes to college and Lisa moves to another city and Maggie starts talking and Homer retires and Marge is left alone in the house on Evergreen Terrace, the show becomes an elegy. It becomes the story of a family that ran out of time. And America, or at least the version of America that keeps watching The Simpsons, is not ready for that story. America wants the version where the kids are always young, where the parents are always together, where the house looks the same every week and the couch is always there, and the opening credits always play, and then Homer gets home and the family is still there, still intact, still the family you've been watching since you were a kid on a couch in a house that might not exist anymore. The floating timeline keeps all of that from ever changing. It presses pause on the moment just before the family would have to start becoming something different, and it holds that moment indefinitely, episode after episode, season after season, until you've been watching for 36 years and the family is still there, and you're not quite sure when you stopped being the kid on the couch and started being the adult with the television on in the background while you fall asleep. The Simpsons don't age because aging means ending. And the American family, as the show has constructed it, cannot be permitted to end. Not in television, not in the cultural imagination. Not in the dream of a comatose man in a hospital bed who just wants his family to still be there when he opens his eyes. The loop isn't their prison. The theory says it's ours. We built it, we maintain it. We tune in every week to make sure the family is still on the couch, and the house still looks right, and the loop is still running. And every time we do, we tighten it a little. We make it a little harder for the Simpsons to escape into a future they've been on the edge of for 36 years and never quite reached. If they escape, if Bart turns 11 and the floating timeline lands and the characters start actually aging toward real futures, the show becomes about time passing, about loss, about the gap between who you were and who you're becoming, about all the things the floating timeline is designed to protect us from feeling. We pressed pause in 1989. We've never pressed play. And so the family sits on the couch, in the same house, on the same street, in the same impossible town, and the television runs, and nothing changes, and the beer is cold, and Homer gets home every evening at the same time, and nothing will ever require us to admit that any of this was temporary, until we turn off the television. And then it's quiet. Section 11. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and Springfield's Hidden Tragedies. You're probably getting sleepy now. That's good. This section is about two characters who exist in Springfield's margins in very different ways, and what those margins reveal about what the show has been saying all along. Let's start with Hans Moleman. If you've watched The Simpsons with any consistency, you know Hans Moleman, the tiny, elderly, nearly blind man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists primarily to suffer. He gets hit by cars, he gets crushed by objects, he gets buried alive, he gets eaten by animals. He walks into traffic. He is struck by lightning. He is incinerated. He falls into things. He has things fall onto him. He has been killed, by a conservative count that different fans arrive at through different methodologies, dozens of times across the series. Not in Treehouse of Horror episodes where the normal rules are suspended and death is obviously comedic. In regular canonical episodes, during the main story, Moleman dies, and then he appears in the next episode completely fine, ready to suffer again. Most viewers accept this as a running gag. Moleman dies. That's the bit. It's funny. Don't think about it. But within the frameworks we've been exploring all evening, Moleman's repeated deaths are genuinely strange. If the radiation theory is correct, Moleman might represent the most extreme mutation in Springfield's contamination history. Homer's body can absorb and survive punishment that should be fatal, because his biology has been altered by decades of nuclear exposure. But Moleman goes further. Moleman actually dies. His body stops functioning, and then it reconstitutes. As if death in Springfield, for certain residents, is not a permanent condition but a temporary state that the body eventually resolves the way it resolves a fever. Whatever the power plant has done to Springfield's biology at the cellular level, Molman's version of that alteration includes a biological reset capability that makes fatal injury reversible. If the coma theory is correct, Molman's deaths serve a different purpose. He is, in the language of the theory, a minor process running in the background of Homer's dream. A supporting character that Homer's unconscious mind doesn't maintain with the same consistency it maintains the central family. Sometimes the process drops. Molman dies because the dream isn't paying close enough attention to keep him continuously alive. Then the dream needs him for the next scene, so he comes back, reconstituted, because the dream requires a certain population density to feel like a real town. Molman, in this reading, is not a person inside the dream. He is furniture. Background detail that the dreaming brain occasionally forgets to maintain and then regenerates when needed. If the collective denial theory is correct, Molman's deaths are simply one more thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public, repeatedly, visibly, in front of witnesses. Nobody investigates. Nobody calls for an ambulance. Nobody asks how he keeps coming back. The town has normalized his death cycle the way it has normalized everything else that should trigger alarm. The three-eyed fish, the billionaire who glows in the dark, the baby who shot a man, the principal who isn't who he says he is. One more impossible thing added to the list of impossible things that Springfield has agreed, through its unspoken social contract, to simply not discuss. And then there's the detail that makes Molman's situation genuinely difficult to explain away. He once mentioned his age. He said he was 31 years old. Look at him. By every visual cue the show provides, Molman appears to be in his 80s or 90s. He is hunched. He is nearly blind. His voice is the voice of an extremely old man. If his stated age is accurate, and there's no reason within the show's logic to assume he's lying, then something aged him catastrophically. Something took a man in his early 30s and advanced his physical appearance by roughly 60 years. Something that also, apparently, made death a revolving door for him rather than a terminus. The radiation theory answers this. Extreme radiation exposure can produce symptoms that look like accelerated aging. Molman, under this reading, represents the outcome of severe long-term contamination on a specific individual biology. Whatever the plant did to him, it did it more intensely and more visibly than it did to anyone else in town. And then, as a secondary effect, it gave him whatever makes death reversible in Springfield's contaminated environment. He is 31 years old. He looks 90. He dies on a regular basis and keeps coming back. If that doesn't qualify as evidence that something unusual is happening in Springfield, it's difficult to articulate what would. Now, Ned Flanders. Ned is in many ways the character the show has been most quietly devastating about over its long run. On the surface, he is the comedic foil to Homer, the neighbor who is everything Homer is not: fit, financially stable, emotionally regulated, devoutly religious, genuinely generous, a good father, a good neighbor, a good person by almost any measure. He is positioned, from early in the series, as the thing Homer is failing to be, the standard by which Homer's many failures are implicitly measured, and the show punishes him for it relentlessly. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, was killed by a t-shirt cannon. This sounds comedic, the setup is comedic, but the mechanism of her death was Homer's selfishness. Homer was dodging the t-shirts being fired into the crowd, and the trajectory of the shirts he deflected sent them into the bleachers where Maud was sitting. His reflexive, impulsive self-protection killed his neighbor's wife. And Ned forgave him, not after a long arc of grief and resentment and eventual hard-won reconciliation. Ned forgave Homer because that's what Ned does. This is played as a character trait. Ned Flanders forgives. Ned Flanders turns the other cheek. Ned Flanders absorbs punishment with grace and patience and an apparently inexhaustible capacity to find the good in the people and situations that have hurt him. It's one of the show's reliable comic dynamics, Homer creating some new form of disaster, and Ned somehow finding it in himself to respond without bitterness. But then the show reveals something that changes the texture of everything we've been watching. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community rebuilds it so poorly that it collapses almost immediately, Ned breaks. He stands in the ruins of his home, surrounded by the evidence that the community he has served and supported and forgiven for decades cannot even build a structure that stays standing. And he has a complete psychological collapse. He screams. He says things he's been holding in for years. He insults people with a specificity and precision that suggests these assessments have been accumulating in him for a long time, carefully stored somewhere below the level of expression. He is institutionalized. And in the institution, the truth comes out. Ned's niceness is not natural. It is not spiritual. It is not the expression of an exceptionally good character that developed organically through his experiences. It is the result of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, being of the counterculture and philosophically opposed to discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him. The therapy worked in the sense that it eliminated the visible expression of Ned's anger, but it didn't eliminate the anger itself. It buried it. It built a psychological structure around it that prevented it from surfacing, and it constructed the persona of Ned Flanders, the kind and patient and endlessly forgiving neighbor, as the face that structure presents to the world. Everything about Ned becomes different once you know this. His patience with Homer isn't saintly. It's pathological. He cannot express anger, not because he doesn't feel it, but because the architecture of his conditioning makes sustained anger expression impossible. His faith isn't primarily spiritual conviction. It is a coping mechanism for a man who needs an external framework of meaning to explain why he keeps suffering when he does everything right and the people around him do everything wrong and get away with it. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death isn't grace. It is the automatic response of a man whose childhood therapy wired his behavioral responses to short-circuit rage before it can reach expression. The show knows this. The show depicted the breakdown. The show showed you what happens when the conditioning fails and the thing underneath it gets out. And the thing underneath is not a monster, which would be easier to deal with. It's a depth of despair that is genuinely bottomless. Ned Flanders has been performing goodness for his entire adult life, maintaining the performance under conditions that would have broken most people long before they broke him, and the performance hasn't been rewarded in any of the ways the logic of goodness suggests it should be. His wife was killed by his neighbor, his house was destroyed by a storm, and rebuilt badly by a community that couldn't even manage carpentry correctly. His faith is devout and constant and sincere, and the show's own continuity establishes that God talks to Homer Simpson, the drunk who falls asleep in church, while apparently never finding the time to address the man who has dedicated his entire life to devotion. God talks to Homer. God ignores Ned. The show means this. It is not accidental. It is the show's explicit statement, made through the specific choices of which characters receive divine communication and which don't. That in Springfield, moral quality is not the determining factor for divine attention or earthly reward. Homer, who does almost everything wrong by any conventional moral framework, gets conversations with God, gets family members who love him despite everything, gets job security despite catastrophic incompetence, gets physical resilience that allows him to survive consequences that would end anyone else. Ned, who does almost everything right, loses his wife, loses his house, carries a psychological cage built around him by therapy that was supposed to help, and maintains his faith to an audience that seems to have stopped listening. That is not random narrative cruelty. That's a thesis. The Simpsons has been saying, quietly, across 36 seasons, that goodness is not rewarded in Springfield, that kindness is not protected. That moral behavior does not determine outcomes in a system where power determines everything. Ned is the most thorough demonstration of this. He is what happens when you follow all the rules in a system that the rules were not designed to protect. Homer is what happens when you follow none of the rules in a system where the rules exist primarily to manage people like Homer rather than to genuinely constrain anyone with real power. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. And the gap between what Ned has done and what Homer has done, and what each of them has received in return, has never once closed. Because in Springfield, the gap doesn't close. The system isn't designed to close it. The system is designed to keep Homer at the power plant, and Ned at the church, and Burns at the top, and Molman in the ground, and everyone exactly where they are forever. That's the final hidden tragedy of Springfield. Not any single character's suffering. The structure that produces and maintains all the suffering simultaneously, without ever quite reaching a point where anyone has to acknowledge it directly. The loop runs, the family sits on the couch, Ned prays and gets no answer. Molman dies and comes back. Burns takes his treatment and keeps going. And Springfield maintains its agreement to notice none of it, because noticing would mean changing, and changing would mean admitting how long things have been the way they are. Section 12. The final theory, everything connects. You've made it a long way into Springfield tonight. Let everything settle now. This is the last part. We spent a long time in this town. We looked at the nuclear plant and what it has been doing to the population for 36 years. We considered the possibility that everything since April 1993 is the dream of a man in a hospital bed who can't let go of his family. We reopened the Burns shooting and found a case that was closed rather than solved. We traced Burns's impossible longevity to a biological maintenance system that depends on the same radiation that poisons his town. We watched Springfield vote to exile the truth. We looked behind Maggie's silence and found the most capable person in the family. We followed Mona Simpson from activism to exile to a cemetery reunion to a quiet room where Homer held her hand as she left for the last time. We examined the predictions and found a show that didn't forecast the future so much as saturate the culture with enough possible futures that the real one always arrives with the feeling of familiarity. We searched for Springfield on every map and found it only in the space between all of them. We watched the floating timeline refuse to land. We counted Molman's deaths. We looked at Ned Flanders' smile and saw everything it's covering. Every theory in this video uses different evidence and arrives by a different path. But every theory arrives at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental and structural. Something that goes deeper than animation conventions or episodic storytelling or the practical necessities of running a show for 36 years. Whether the cause is radiation or dreaming or institutional denial or the engineered longevity of an ancient billionaire or some combination of all of them, the effect is the same. The family doesn't change. The town doesn't change. The consequences don't stick. The catastrophes don't accumulate. The truth keeps getting expelled on a train, and the lie keeps being voted into law, and the plant keeps leaking, and Homer keeps going back to work, and Burns keeps glowing, and Maggie keeps watching everything from behind her pacifier, and nobody, in 36 years, has managed to look up at those cracked cooling towers and ask the question that everything in this video has been circling. Why are we all like this? The show has been telling you the answer since season 1. Not through any dramatic revelation or carefully structured arc, through accumulation, through the patient, relentless layering of detail upon detail upon detail until the picture becomes undeniable if you're willing to look at it. The Simpsons is not hiding its mysteries. It has never been hiding them. It shows them to you every single week. The three-eyed fish, the skeletons in the basement, the billionaire who glows, and the baby who waited to be alone before she mimicked, pulling a trigger, and the principal who isn't who he says he is, and the man who comes back from the dead every other episode, and the town that chooses comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, and the family that never ages in the house, that never changes on the street, that could be anywhere in America. All of it visible. All of it right there on screen. The reason nobody in Springfield sees it is that the show has given us multiple possible explanations for the blindness. Radiation-induced cognitive damage, dream logic, collective social agreement. The weight of an economic system that depends on the blindness continuing. Any of those explanations could be true. All of them might be operating simultaneously. The theories aren't competing with each other. They're describing the same phenomenon from different angles. The way different instruments in an orchestra are all playing the same note at the same time, and the note only becomes music when you hear all of them at once. Springfield is a contamination zone, and a dream and a community organized around deliberate forgetting and a closed economic loop that depends on its own population being too damaged to question it. All of those things at once. And the family at its center, the family on the couch, the family the show has been about for 3.5 decades, is both the product of all those systems and the thing that somehow survives them. Homer survives because he can't be killed inside his own dream, and because the radiation has made him nearly indestructible, and because Burns needs him alive, and because the show needs him alive, and because the family needs him alive. All of those reasons simultaneously. The same event explained by 4 different theories, none of them wrong. The theories don't compete, they layer. And at the bottom of all the layers, underneath the radiation and the coma and the denial and the institutional corruption, there is something very simple. Homer loves his family. That's it. That's the thing that sits at the center of all the complexity, the thing every theory is ultimately a way of talking about. Homer Simpson, damaged and impulsive and cognitively impaired, and working for the man who destroyed his childhood and dreaming in a hospital bed and breathing contaminated air and unable to make the connections that would allow him to understand his own situation, loves his family with a completeness that nothing in Springfield has managed to diminish. The coma theory says his brain is generating a dream specifically to keep that love intact. The radiation theory says his mutated biology makes him physically capable of surviving any threat to the family. The denial theory says the town's collective forgetting is partly motivated by a shared, unspoken desire to protect the families inside it. Even Burns, the architect of so much of Springfield's suffering, is sustained by an elaborate survival infrastructure that is ultimately about refusing to let anything end. Everyone in Springfield, in their own way, is trying not to let the thing they love most slip away. And the show, across 800 episodes and 36 years, has kept finding new ways to tell that story. Dressed it in different plots and different guest stars and different references and different levels of absurdity. But the story underneath has always been the same. A family on a couch, a father who keeps coming home, children who stay young, a mother who holds it all together through sheer force of will and love, a baby watching everything and waiting for the right moment. If Homer is dreaming, he's been dreaming for 30 years about this. The same house, the same family, the same Friday evenings. He's been holding on to them through a whole life he wasn't conscious to live, keeping them safe inside the only space he still controls. If the radiation is real and the contamination is real and the damage is real, the family has been surviving it together, imperfectly, loudly, often destructively, but together. If Springfield is a community organized around collective denial, the thing the denial is protecting, at least in part, is the possibility of ordinary life inside it. The possibility that Homer can go to work and come home and sit on the couch and everything will be more or less okay. The mysteries don't unsettle the core of the show, they deepen it. They make every episode an act of something, a dying man's dream, a contaminated town's refusal to give up on ordinary life, a community's complicated, compromised, imperfect love for itself. And you, here, watching this in whatever hour of the night it is, with the lights low and the blanket pulled up, have been part of that love for as long as you've been watching The Simpsons. Whatever Springfield is, whether it's a dream or a contamination zone or a community organized around denial or all three at once, it belongs to everyone who has ever sat down on a couch and felt something when the opening credits played. The Simpsons won't end. The timeline won't land. Homer will come home tomorrow and the family will be there and the beer will be cold and the television will be on and nothing will change because we won't let it. We built the loop, we're maintaining it. Every time we watch, we tighten it a little. And that's fine, because sometimes what you need, at the end of a long day, is a house that looks the same and a family that's still there and a town that hasn't changed since the last time you checked. Even if the town glows a little in the dark, even if the fish have too many eyes, even if the man on the hill has been there longer than anyone should be able to manage, even if Homer is still dreaming, Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. That's the whole point. Good night. End of script. Total word count, approximately 49,000 words. Expanded Section 1 deeper into the plant. Let's go back into the plant for a moment, because there's more sitting in those walls than the initial pass-through reveals. The kind of detail that accumulates slowly over 36 seasons of storytelling until it reaches a critical mass that the show itself never quite names directly, but that is undeniably there if you spend enough time with it. The Springfield nuclear power plant was not always Burns's. This is a fact the show introduces casually and then leaves largely unexplored. Burns acquired it. Before he did, it was presumably a different kind of facility, presumably compliant, presumably staffed by people who understood what they were working with. The transition from whatever it was before to what it became under Burns's management is a story the show gestures toward without ever fully telling. But the implication embedded in every episode that touches on the plant's history is clear enough. Burns didn't inherit a catastrophe. He created one, slowly, through a series of deliberate choices about what was worth spending money on and what wasn't, about which regulations were worth following and which were more expensive than the risk of ignoring them, about what kind of relationship he wanted to maintain with the regulatory apparatus responsible for monitoring a facility like his. The answer? consistently, was the minimum possible relationship, the least compliance he could get away with, the most violations he could sustain before the cost of maintaining them exceeded the cost of fixing them. And the way you ensure that calculation never tips in the wrong direction is by ensuring that the person whose job it is to find the violations is someone who will not find them. Homer as a safety strategy. That's the reading the theory invites, and it's a reading that the show supports through specific moments spread across its run. Consider the episode in which Homer discovers the extent of his own negligence. There are several such episodes actually, which is itself remarkable. Most shows might do one story in which the protagonist discovers they've been failing at their job. The Simpsons has done this multiple times, and each time Homer discovers some new dimension of how thoroughly he has been not doing the one thing he was hired to do, the show treats it as comedy and moves on. The violations accumulate, the plant stays open, Homer keeps his job, and by the next episode, the specific failure of this particular episode has been forgotten, and the baseline level of catastrophic incompetence has simply become the new normal. The gum on the cooling tower is perhaps the most economical image the show ever produced for this. A crack in a critical piece of infrastructure, a piece of chewing gum stretched across it. That's the gap between the facility as it's supposed to exist and the facility as it actually exists. A wad of gum between Springfield and a cooling system failure. Now think about the water. Springfield's water supply receives runoff from multiple directions, and at least some of those directions lead back to the plant's waste disposal. The show has been explicit about this, depicting the dumping of radioactive waste into waterways, with a casualness that, within the show's comedic register, is supposed to be funny, but that, when you step back from the comedic framing and consider it as a literal description of what's happening in this fictional town, is deeply alarming. Radioactive contamination of a municipal water supply would produce effects over time. Long-term, low-level radiation exposure through drinking water is not an immediate catastrophic event. It's a slow, cumulative process. It damages cellular structures gradually, over years and decades. It affects developing biology more severely than adult biology, which is why children are always the primary concern in real-world radiation contamination events. And it affects neurological development in ways that can be subtle and difficult to attribute directly to the source, which is part of what makes it so useful as a tool of quiet population management. If you happen to be the kind of billionaire who benefits from having a population that isn't sharp enough to question what's being done to them. Springfield's children were all born and raised in this environment. They have been drinking this water and breathing this air since before they were born, because their mothers were also doing so, and the effects of in utero radiation exposure are among the most studied and most concerning in the scientific literature on nuclear contamination. The children of Springfield, every single one of them, have been marinating in whatever the plant has been releasing since their cells first divided. And yet the children of Springfield seem, on the surface, to be fine. Bart is energetic and inventive and mischievous. Lisa is brilliant and emotionally perceptive. Maggie is, as we'll get into later in this video, almost superhumanly capable in ways that become more apparent the longer you watch. The children are fine. Unless they're not fine, and what we're interpreting as fine is actually the new baseline for what fine looks like in a population that has never known anything else. A child born into a contaminated environment doesn't know they're contaminated. A child raised on water that produces neurological effects doesn't have a comparison point for what their cognition would look like without those effects. The abnormal becomes normal simply through being the only thing you've ever experienced. Homer's IQ of 55 is, by any clinical standard, significantly below the threshold for independent adult functioning. And yet Homer has held a job, maintained a marriage, raised 3 children, and navigated the social complexities of a small community for his entire adult life. Within Springfield's context, an IQ of 55 is functional because the average cognitive baseline in Springfield is, the theory suggests, significantly lower than it would be in a town without a leaking nuclear reactor upstream. Homer isn't disabled relative to Springfield's population. He's roughly typical. The disability is collective. The fish with 3 eyes appeared in the river, and it was news. It generated enough concern that it became a political issue. And then it was resolved through the specific kind of resolution that Springfield applies to all its inconvenient discoveries. A powerful person performed a demonstration designed to make the concern seem irrational. The demonstration worked, and the concern evaporated. Burns ate the fish. The fish tasted fine, apparently. Therefore, the fish is fine. Therefore, the water is fine. Therefore, everyone is fine. This is how the contamination has maintained itself for 3 decades. Not through secrecy exactly. The plant is visible to everyone. The waste disposal practices have been observed. The violations have been counted and catalogued at least once. None of it is hidden. It's just that every time the evidence accumulates to the point where it might generate real scrutiny, something happens to disperse that scrutiny before it can consolidate into action. Burns eats the fish. Homer gets promoted in a way that makes his continued employment at the plant seem like an endorsement of its safety. A political candidate who champions cleanup finds their campaign undermined through mechanisms the show implies but doesn't always make explicit. The system deflects, and the water keeps running, and the fish keep mutating, and the people of Springfield keep living their yellow-skinned, four-fingered, extraordinary healing rate lives in a town they've never questioned, because questioning it would require the kind of critical thinking that the water supply has been quietly impairing for a generation. The human skeletons in the basement deserve one more pass. The show drops this detail and leaves it. Most viewers absorb it as a dark gag, the kind of throwaway mordant detail that The Simpsons scatters throughout its run to keep the observant viewer slightly unsettled. And within the comedic register, that's exactly what it is. But within the framework of the theory, those skeletons are the most explicit acknowledgement the show ever makes of what Burns's plant has actually done. Someone died in that building. More than one someone. They died in circumstances that the show never characterizes, never investigates, never returns to after the initial revelation. And the facility kept operating. The workers kept going to work. Homer kept sleeping at his workstation. The violations kept accumulating. The plant stayed open. Because in Springfield, the discovery of human remains inside a nuclear facility is the kind of thing that gets added to a list of 342 violations and then factored into an estimated repair cost that the owner decides is too expensive to bother with. That's Springfield. That's the town under the plant's shadow. That's the place where the show has been set for 36 years, and where it will continue to be set for however many more years it keeps running. And in that town, on a hill that everyone can see from their front yards, the cooling towers stand, still cracked, still patched, still leaking something invisible into the air that everyone in town breathes without thinking about it. Because in Springfield, you stop thinking about things pretty early in life. The water sees to that. Expanded Section 2 deeper into the coma. There's a texture to Homer's coma theory that the basic outline doesn't quite capture. To feel it properly, you need to sit with the individual episodes and ask yourself what they feel like when the coma is true. Think about a random episode from season 14. Homer is doing something improbable. The plot escalates in ways that no grounded family drama would permit. Guest stars appear who have no particular reason to be in Springfield. The story resolves in a way that leaves no lasting trace on anyone's circumstances. The credits roll. Everyone is exactly where they were at the beginning. Now watch it again with the understanding that this is a dream. Something shifts. The improbability stops being a sign of lazy writing and becomes something that feels much more personal. Dreams escalate in exactly this way. They begin somewhere recognizable, and then the logic stretches, and then the logic bends entirely, and then you're in a place that looks like the place you started but operates on completely different principles, and it feels normal because inside the dream the stretched logic is the only logic you have access to. Homer's dreams aren't incoherent. They're very specifically coherent in the way that dreams are coherent. Emotionally rather than narratively. The emotional through line of every episode, regardless of how surreal the plot becomes, is Homer finding his way back to his family. Homer missing his family. Homer doing something that threatens his family, and then recovering, making it right, being forgiven, sitting back down on the couch. The emotional engine doesn't change. Only the external circumstances keep shifting, becoming more elaborate, more impossible, more dream-shaped. And there's something else. The guest stars. Think about the volume of celebrity appearances in the later seasons compared to the early ones. In seasons 1 through 4, the guests are occasional and relatively grounded. They appear as themselves in contexts that make rough narrative sense. Celebrities as themselves in the world of the show. After the coma episode, the volume increases dramatically, and the contexts become increasingly elaborate. Famous people appear in Springfield with less and less justification for being there. The show stops even trying to explain why a specific celebrity would be in this specific town on this specific episode. Under the coma theory, this is exactly what you'd expect. Homer's hospital room has a television. His family visits and talks about things happening in the world. Nurses and doctors have conversations within earshot. The radio plays. Names and voices drift into his unconscious processing, and the dreaming brain, working with whatever raw material it has access to, weaves them into the dream. Not as precise reproductions of those people, as dream versions, built from fragments of recognition, appearing in Springfield because the dreaming mind doesn't have better placement for them, and the dream doesn't require the justification that waking life demands. The celebrity flood of the later seasons is Homer absorbing media from beyond his hospital bed. The richness of detail in those appearances reflects the richness of the ambient information available to him. Family members talking about who was on television last night. A nurse mentioning something in the news. The murmur of morning shows playing in the corridor. Homer takes all of it in, and his brain does what dreaming brains do, which is incorporate it into the story already being told. There's also the question of what Homer's dream is actually for. Why does the dreaming brain bother maintaining such an elaborate simulation? What is it trying to protect? Dreams, according to several frameworks for understanding sleep and unconscious processing, serve functions related to emotional regulation and memory consolidation. The dreaming brain returns to significant experiences and processes them, sometimes directly and sometimes through metaphor, working through the emotional weight of things that happened while the person was awake. Under this model, Homer's coma dream is his brain's attempt to process the emotional reality of his situation, that the family he loves is out there somewhere, continuing their lives without him, and that he is not there to be part of it. The dream preserves them as they were because that's all the brain has. The family, as Homer last saw them, is the only version of the family that the dreaming brain can access. So it runs that version, over and over, in slightly different configurations, with slightly different external circumstances, but always returning to the same core: the house, the family, the couch, the television, Homer coming home. The escalating impossibility of the later seasons isn't the dream deteriorating. Or, rather, it is. But what's deteriorating isn't the brain's commitment to the dream. It's the brain's ability to maintain the stable, grounded version of the dream that the early seasons represented. As Homer's coma deepens, and the years pass, and the neurological damage accumulates, the dream becomes less precise and more impressionistic. The family is still there. The house is still there. But the world surrounding them gets stranger and less anchored because the brain generating it is less capable of sustaining the detailed, internally consistent simulation it was running in the early years. The Simpsons getting progressively more surreal isn't a symptom of creative decline. Under the coma theory, it's a symptom of Homer's medical decline. And the fact that every episode ends with Homer back on the couch, back with his family, back in the house, no matter what happened during the 22 minutes preceding it, is the dream's most fundamental commitment. Whatever else the unconscious mind generates, wherever the dream goes during the episode, it always comes home. Because coming home is the thing Homer most needs to believe he can do. Every reset is a reassurance. Every return to normal is Homer's brain telling itself the thing it most needs to hear. You made it back, they're still here, it's okay, you're home. The theory also has something to say about the episodes that don't work. Every long-running show has them. Episodes that feel disconnected from the show's emotional core, that feel like they were generated by someone who understood the surface vocabulary of the show without understanding what the show was about underneath. Under the coma theory, these are the episodes where Homer's dream lost the thread temporarily. The simulation dropped a layer of depth. The brain was running lower on whatever sustains the richer, more emotionally coherent material. And the result was an episode that goes through the motions without the feeling. Homer's brain, declining in a hospital bed, occasionally producing output that looks like The Simpsons but doesn't quite feel like it. This is not to say that every weak episode is a symptom of neural deterioration. Some weak episodes are just weak episodes. But the pattern, the unmistakable pattern of the show's tonal shift from grounded domestic comedy to increasingly improbable surreal adventure, and the equally unmistakable pattern of that shift beginning in the season immediately after the coma episode, is not something the coma theory has to reach to explain. It explains it naturally, as a consequence, as the most direct possible expression of the premise. Homer went under in April of 1993. The show changed. The show has kept changing. And somewhere in Springfield General, a man in a hospital bed keeps generating the same dream, keeps finding his way home, keeps choosing the fog over the terrible clarity of waking up and finding out how long he's been gone. 36 years of episodes. 36 years of Homer finding his way home by the end of every single one. That's not lazy writing, that's devotion. That's a brain that has been telling itself the same story every day for 3 decades because the story is the only thing keeping it going. The dream doesn't stop because Homer won't let it. Because the moment it stops, he has to find out what's on the other side. Expanded Section 3 deeper into the Burns shooting. To fully appreciate the scale of the Who Shot Burns mystery, you need to understand the summer of 1995 in American television. This was before streaming, before the internet had become the primary arena for cultural conversation. People watched television when it aired, and then they talked about it at work and at school and over back fences, and the biggest shows generated the kind of sustained communal conversation that is almost impossible to replicate in the current fragmented media environment. The Simpsons in 1995 was not a nostalgia property. It was not the show that used to be good. It was at the absolute peak of its cultural influence. The Golden Age, as fans now call it, was still being made. The writing was sharper than it had ever been. The show was producing episodes that have become, in retrospect, some of the most celebrated half-hours of television ever created. And it chose this moment, this specific peak of its cultural power, to attempt something that no animated show had ever attempted, a genuine serialized mystery arc. The summer of 1995, the gap between Part 1 and Part 2 was a real cultural event. People theorized in the ways available to them before the internet made theorizing frictionless. In newspapers, in magazines, in conversations with people they saw in person, in early online forums that a very small percentage of the population had access to. The theorizing was effortful in a way that internet theorizing is not, and that effort made people more invested in the resolution, which makes the resolution more interesting to examine because of who it satisfied and who it didn't. The people most invested in the mystery, the ones who had spent the summer working through the clues and building cases and arguing with each other about which character had the strongest motive and the clearest opportunity, were largely unsatisfied by Maggie. Not because the answer was wrong, necessarily, but because the answer was unreachable from the evidence available. Nobody had gotten it right. The one person who had apparently guessed correctly had done so through the internet and then disappeared, leaving no trail, taking their reasoning with them. Everyone else had been tricked. And the trick was, in retrospect, almost too effective. The show had seeded enough red herrings and misdirections that any reasonably attentive viewer had built a case around one of the plausible adult suspects. Homer was the strongest candidate by the evidence. DNA, fingerprints, motive. Smithers was emotionally compelling. Fired that day, decades of repressed resentment, intimate knowledge of Burns's movements and weapon. Marge was thematically resonant. The protective mother pushed too far by the destruction of her children's school. Maggie was none of those things, which is either the genius of the mystery or its flaw, depending on how you read the intention. The resolution was a genuine surprise. It was also genuinely unsupported by the prior episode in the way the show implied it would be. Burns's last words deserve extended consideration. "Oh, it's you." 3 words that the show presents as recognition without threat, acknowledgement without alarm. The tone in the voice acting is unmistakable. Mild surprise, almost warmth, the register of someone encountering someone familiar in an unexpected place. This doesn't track with Maggie. Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer has been his employee for years. Burns has demonstrated across multiple episodes that he maintains essentially no memory of people who aren't directly useful to him on a regular basis. He can't hold Homer's name in his memory despite constant repetition. He refers to him by wrong names, wrong descriptions, wrong physical characteristics. The idea that Burns would recognize a baby in a parking lot and respond to that recognition with the warm acknowledgement of, "Oh, it's you," requires a prior relationship with that baby that the show had never established. It works for Marge. Burns's brief infatuation with Marge in the episode Marge Gets a Job establishes a prior emotional connection that would explain the recognition and the warmth of the acknowledgement. It works for Smithers, whose face Burns presumably knows better than almost anyone else's. It works for Homer, who despite Burns's inability to remember his name, Burns might well recognize visually after years of daily proximity. It doesn't work for Maggie. The alternate endings tell an interesting story about the writer's relationship to their own resolution. The Smithers ending that was produced and then exhibited in the 138th episode Spectacular was complete. Fully voiced, fully animated. It was not a rough draft or a sketched-out alternative. It was a finished piece of content that could have aired as the actual resolution. The writers built 2 complete endings and then chose one. What determined the choice? The commentary suggests it was partly about avoiding the most obvious answer, and partly about the formal challenge of a resolution that no viewer would anticipate. Both of those are legitimate creative considerations. An unsatisfying mystery that surprises is better, in some ways, than a predictable mystery that resolves neatly. The Simpsons has always valued surprise over satisfaction. But the choice of Maggie creates a specific kind of aftermath. A resolution that can never be fully interrogated because the identified perpetrator cannot be questioned. Maggie cannot confess. Maggie cannot explain her reasoning. Maggie cannot be cross-examined. Whatever Maggie knows about what happened in that parking lot is sealed inside a baby who has maintained perfect silence on the subject for 30 years. Which means the resolution is, structurally, immune to challenge. You cannot disprove Maggie's guilt because Maggie cannot speak to it. You cannot confirm it either, for the same reason. The case rests on Burns's testimony from his hospital bed upon waking from a coma, on DNA evidence that pointed to a Simpson rather than specifically to Maggie, and on the physical logic of a baby finding a gun on the ground and having it discharge. All of which is plausible, none of which is airtight. And Homer's confession in season 18 sits there, unaddressed, in the show's own continuity. Homer says he did it. Nobody reacts. Nobody investigates. The confession doesn't generate any narrative consequence, which is either because Homer is lying for reasons the show never explains, or because the show is acknowledging, in the only way it can acknowledge it without actually reopening the case, that the original verdict was wrong. A man confessed to a crime for which a baby was blamed, and the show moved on. In Springfield, that kind of thing apparently just happens sometimes. Expanded Section 4, deeper into Burns's longevity. The Three Stooges syndrome diagnosis deserves more time than the initial pass-through gives it, because it's one of the most medically strange and thematically rich pieces of world-building The Simpsons ever produced. A doctor informs Burns that he has every disease simultaneously, every known pathogen, every known degenerative condition. The human body hosts, at any given time, many microorganisms, many of which are potentially pathogenic but kept in check by a functioning immune system. The immune system is an extraordinarily sophisticated balancing act, managing threats through a process of identification, response, and suppression that happens continuously and mostly invisibly throughout a healthy life. Burns's immune system, presumably, no longer works in any conventional sense. A century of radiation exposure, the weekly treatments, the extraordinary medical history he has accumulated, have left his body in a state that no standard immunological framework can describe. His diseases aren't being kept in check by conventional immunity. They're being kept in check by each other. The competition between pathogens, the biological equivalent of multiple enemies fighting each other rather than combining against a common target, has created an equilibrium that no medical intervention produced and that no medical intervention would likely be able to replicate deliberately. The doctor can't cure Burns. The doctor can't even really treat Burns. He can only observe the equilibrium and note that it exists, and that as long as it holds, Burns will continue to function in his extraordinary and medically unprecedented way. The weekly radiation treatments don't disrupt this equilibrium. They maintain it. Burns's body, after a century of managed radiation exposure, requires the continued input to maintain the cellular conditions under which the disease equilibrium can hold. Remove the radiation and the balance tips. One disease gains an advantage. The others respond, but the response is delayed, and in that delay, the winning disease can make enough progress to collapse the whole system. Burns dies not of any single illness, but of the cascade failure that follows when one illness breaks through the stasis that was holding everything in check. It's nuclear maintenance at the cellular level. His body is a reactor, and his diseases are the fuel, held in precisely balanced criticality by the weekly addition of controlled radiation. Too little radiation and the fuel goes subcritical. The diseases lose their equilibrium, one gains dominance. Too much and the system goes prompt critical. The diseases all surge simultaneously and destroy their host in a matter of days. The weekly treatment administers exactly the right amount to keep everything balanced right on the edge. Smithers's role in this cannot be understated. He doesn't just manage Burns's schedule, he manages the timing of Burns's continued existence. A day's delay in the treatment schedule could be enough to introduce the instability that starts the cascade. A week's delay would certainly be enough. Smithers manages Burns the way a reactor operator manages a running reactor, with constant vigilance, immediate response to any deviation from the expected parameters, and the understanding that the consequences of failure are not theoretical. And Smithers has maintained this vigil for decades. Not because he has no other options, not because he's trapped. He maintains it because the relationship between them, however unequal and however often Burns fails to appreciate it, is the central organizing reality of Smithers's life. His devotion is real, even if its origins are partly explained by the practical knowledge that leaving would be fatal. He has arranged his entire existence around keeping this one impossible man alive for one more week, and then another week, and then another, in a commitment that has no defined endpoint and no guarantee of reciprocation. That's not the relationship of a devoted assistant and a grateful employer. That's something stranger and sadder and more specific than that. Burns's historical references also become more interesting when you sit with them. He describes the Gilded Age not as history but as personal memory. He has mentioned figures from the early 20th century as acquaintances. His understanding of World War II is the understanding of a participant rather than a student, and his participation was not straightforwardly honorable, a detail the show acknowledges and then leaves largely unexplored. The question of the trillion-dollar bill is one of the more remarkable things the show ever introduced and then declined to fully develop. During World War II, Burns claims to have personally received a trillion-dollar bill from President Roosevelt, intended as a recovery payment for Europe. Burns kept it. He has been holding a document representing $1 trillion, a bill that would be the most valuable single piece of currency ever issued by the United States government, in his personal possession for roughly 80 years. The show treated this as a plot device for one episode and then moved on. But the existence of that bill, and Burns's casual possession of it for 8 decades, says something about how Burns relates to the institutions that might otherwise constrain him. The bill is technically government property. Burns has been withholding it since the mid-1940s. He has presumably been legally obligated to return it for the entire duration of his post-war life. He has simply chosen not to, and the government has either not noticed or has decided that pursuing it is more trouble than it's worth. This is the pattern. Burns does things that by rights should generate severe legal consequences. He operates a facility with hundreds of safety violations for decades without meaningful regulatory response. He maintains a biological weapons facility until activists destroy it. He blocks out the sun. He steals a $1 trillion bill from the federal government. He keeps human remains in his basement. And the consequences that should follow simply don't materialize, because the machinery of accountability that should produce those consequences has been managed, bought, compromised, or simply overwhelmed by the sheer scale of Burns's wealth and the breadth of his influence. Nobody can hold Burns accountable because Burns got to every mechanism of accountability before accountability could reach him. That's not a cartoon villain's scheme. That's a description of how concentrated wealth actually functions in relation to institutional oversight. Burns has been demonstrating this for 36 years. The show has been demonstrating it with him, using him as the clearest possible illustration of a simple truth, that systems of accountability are built to manage ordinary levels of wealth and influence, and that extraordinary concentrations of either can place an individual effectively beyond the reach of those systems. Burns is beyond the reach of every system. He has been for over a century. And the weekly treatment that keeps him alive is the most intimate expression of this reality. Even death has been made to wait. Because for Burns, everything waits. Expanded Section 5 deeper into Springfield's denial. The vote in The Principal and the Pauper isn't just a story beat. It's a template for understanding every other moment in the show's history where something important has simply not been addressed. Let's trace what happens when Springfield is confronted with something it cannot comfortably absorb. A three-eyed fish appears in the river. The obvious implication is environmental contamination from the power plant. A political candidate makes this argument explicitly. Burns eats the fish on television. The issue dissolves. What happened? The issue didn't get resolved. Nobody ran tests to confirm the water's safety. Nobody investigated the disposal practices at the plant. Nobody followed the three-eyed fish to its logical implications. What happened was that a sufficiently powerful countermeasure was deployed against the building concern, and the concern, lacking the institutional support to withstand a determined billionaire eating a fish on television, collapsed. That's not resolution, that's suppression. But suppression achieved through social theater is indistinguishable from resolution to a population that has been cognitively affected by the very contamination under discussion. The dome in the Simpsons movie represents the most extreme version of this pattern. The federal government looks at Springfield and concludes that the only appropriate response to the level of environmental contamination in the town is physical containment, a dome. The entire community, sealed under a glass shell. The United States government has decided that Springfield is so thoroughly toxic that it cannot be permitted to exist in normal contact with the rest of the country. And what happens? The dome comes down. Springfield is liberated. Homer saves the town. Everyone cheers. And then by the first episode of the following season, the dome is not mentioned again. The town that was classified as an environmental hazard serious enough to require physical containment by the federal government returned to normal operations within, at most, a few months. The contamination that prompted the dome didn't go anywhere. The plant that caused the contamination is still running. Homer is still the safety inspector. Nothing changed except that the dome came down and everyone agreed, through the unspoken social contract that the principal and the pauper finally made explicit, not to discuss the dome anymore. The collective denial in Springfield is not a passive process. It requires active maintenance. The denial has to be renewed every time something happens that might threaten it. Every catastrophic event that gets forgotten has to be forgotten deliberately through a social process of mutual agreement to look away from the evidence and resume normal operations. The town is not merely forgetful. The town is actively choosing what to remember and what to release. And the mechanism that enforces this choice, the mechanism that the principal and the pauper made visible, is social expulsion. The real Skinner was tied to a train and removed from Springfield because he represented a truth the town couldn't afford to acknowledge. Anyone who represents an inconvenient truth in Springfield becomes, in effect, the real Skinner. They exist in the community for a while, making the uncomfortable argument, presenting the uncomfortable evidence, demanding that the community confront the thing it has decided not to confront. And then, through some mechanism, they leave, or they're discredited. Or they find that the social cost of continuing to make the argument exceeds their capacity to sustain it. Burns has been the beneficiary of this process throughout his tenure. Every challenge to his operation of the plant has eventually dissolved. Every advocate for accountability has eventually stopped advocating. The pattern is too consistent to be entirely accidental. It reflects the operation of a community that has found, through long experience, that the most efficient response to an uncomfortable truth is to remove the person making it and then agree that the truth was never made. Lisa's position in this dynamic is worth pausing on because it illuminates something about the show's own relationship to the themes it's been developing for 36 years. Lisa is the character who most consistently makes the uncomfortable argument. She is the character who looks at Springfield and describes what she sees rather than what the social agreement says should be seen. She identifies the plant as a source of contamination. She questions Burns's authority. She advocates for environmental protection and economic justice and educational equity in a community that has organized itself around not thinking about any of those things. She is, functionally, the show's internal representative of the position the theories being discussed in this video are taking. And what happens to Lisa? She is ignored. She is dismissed. She is loved by her family in the warm, impotent way that you love someone whose arguments you're not going to act on. She continues making her arguments because that's who she is, and the community continues not acting on them, and nothing changes. Lisa Simpson is the real Skinner who wasn't tied to a train. Instead of being expelled, she was simply never listened to. The expulsion happened at the level of influence rather than geography. She's still in Springfield, still making the arguments, still pointing at the three-eyed fish, and the cracked cooling towers and the human skeletons and asking the questions that the community has decided are too expensive to answer. And every week the next episode begins, and the community has not acted on her arguments, and the plant is still running, and the fish still have too many eyes. That's Springfield's denial at its most sophisticated. Not the dramatic expulsion on a train, The quiet, continuous, enormously effective process of loving someone without listening to them. Expanded Section 6 deeper into Maggie's capabilities. The daycare rebellion in The Longest Daycare is worth examining in granular detail, because when you slow it down and look at each decision Maggie makes in sequence, the cognitive profile it reveals is extraordinary. The facility is new to Maggie. She has never been there before. She arrives, and within a very short time frame, she has mapped the relevant geography. Which areas are accessible, which are monitored, which provide cover, which represent obstacles. This environmental mapping, performed rapidly in an unfamiliar space, is a cognitive task that challenges adults in novel environments. Maggie does it seamlessly, as a preliminary to the actual task she's about to undertake, as if environmental mapping is so automatic for her that it barely qualifies as a step in her planning process. Then she identifies the caterpillar. This is the thing she decides to protect. Her decision to protect it is itself worth noting. The caterpillar is not under immediate threat at the moment she discovers it. She identifies a potential future threat, assesses it, and decides to take preemptive action. This is forward-thinking, anticipatory reasoning. It requires holding a model of future events in mind and acting in the present to influence those future events, which is a cognitively sophisticated activity that develops relatively late in human childhood and that many adults don't perform reliably. Then she identifies Gerald, the bully, as the threat. She observes his behavior and extracts a behavioral model from it. This is the kind of individual who does this kind of thing in this kind of environment. She then uses that model to predict what Gerald will do next and plans around those predictions. Her planning accounts for Gerald's likely responses to her actions, adjusting the plan to minimize the risk of interference. She also has to account for the daycare staff, who represent a different kind of obstacle. She cannot openly oppose Gerald because doing so would attract staff attention and result in her being removed from the relevant area. She has to achieve her goal while appearing, to the staff, to be doing nothing in particular. This requires maintaining two different behavioral presentations simultaneously: the actual behavior, which is covert planning and execution, and the presented behavior, which is being a normal baby doing normal baby things. Maggie does this throughout the film. She executes complex plans while appearing unremarkable to the adult observers. This is social camouflage at a level that most adults find difficult to sustain and that no developmental framework for infant cognition would predict. And she succeeds. The caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Gerald is thwarted. The daycare returns to its normal operations. Maggie leaves without having drawn any significant attention to herself. She accomplished a sophisticated multi-step goal in an unfamiliar environment against active opposition, while maintaining behavioral cover adequate to avoid detection. Then she goes home and sits in her high chair and makes pacifier sounds, and the family treats her as a baby, which is what she wants them to do. The theory is that Maggie made a decision, early and deliberately, about the relationship she wanted to maintain with the world around her. She watched Lisa. She observed the outcomes that followed from visible intelligence, from the choice to be openly, loudly, undeniably the smartest person in the room. She watched her sister be dismissed and isolated, and ground down by the accumulated friction of existing in an environment that didn't want to make space for what she was. And she decided that wasn't the relationship she wanted with her environment. But she also had a model in front of her that was even more instructive. She watched Homer. Homer, whose lack of visible competence afforded him a freedom that visible competence never would have. Homer moved through Springfield with an ease that Lisa never managed, not because he was more capable, but because the community's expectations of him were so low that he consistently, accidentally, met them. Nobody was watching Homer critically. Nobody was holding Homer to a standard. Homer could fail and be loved, and fail again, and be loved again, and the failure never accumulated into anything that threatened his place in the family or the community. The bar was low enough that Homer cleared it without trying. Maggie isn't trying to be Homer, but she recognized something in Homer's situation that was unavailable to Lisa's: the protection of low expectations, the freedom that comes from being underestimated. If nobody watches you closely, nobody sees what you're actually doing. And if nobody sees what you're actually doing, you can do almost anything. Maggie adopted this as a strategy at an age when most children are still figuring out that other people have inner lives. She decided to be invisible. She decided to be the baby. She decided that the pacifier and the silence and the occasional fall while trying to walk were worth maintaining as long as they kept the protective cloak of other people's low expectations in place. And it has worked for 36 years. Every remarkable thing Maggie has done, she has done below the level of attention. Every demonstration of her actual capabilities has occurred in spaces and moments where nobody was watching closely enough to fully register what they were seeing. The show knows what she's doing. The viewer, if they're paying attention, knows what she's doing. But the characters around her, the family and the community, have never quite assembled the accumulation of evidence into the conclusion it points toward. Because Maggie hasn't let them. She controls the information available to them about her, and she controls it through the simplest possible mechanism: silence. Not saying anything means not giving anyone data. Not giving anyone data means they have to rely on assumptions. And Maggie has carefully cultivated the assumptions she wants them to rely on. 1 year old. Silent. Not quite walking. Needs to be carried. Needs to be fed. Needs to be watched. Needs to be protected. She needs none of those things. Not in the way anyone around her assumes. But as long as everyone around her believes she does, she operates in the most protected space imaginable. She is the baby. Nobody expects anything of the baby. Nobody worries about what the baby might be thinking. Nobody monitors the baby closely enough to notice what the baby is actually doing. Behind the pacifier, behind those enormous observant eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate, strategic silence, something is thinking. Something has been thinking since before the show learned how to describe it. And whatever Maggie decides to do with that thinking, whenever she decides the moment has arrived to let it be visible, Springfield is going to be caught completely off guard, which is precisely how she designed it. Expanded Section 7 deeper into Mona's story. The year 1969. In Springfield, in a house on a street that looked not much different from any other house on any other street in any other American town. A woman doing dishes. A child somewhere in the house. A husband who came home from work and sat in a chair and watched the news, which in 1969 was news of a particular kind. Vivid, disturbing, impossible to ignore. A world making demands on the conscience that ordinary domestic life kept insisting you could set aside. Mona Simpson set nothing aside. The show describes her radicalization with the specific affection it reserves for things it wants you to half laugh at and half take seriously. She became a hippie. She joined a counterculture movement. She began attending gatherings and reading materials and participating in conversations that her husband and her community had no context for and limited patience with. She was, from the perspective of 1969 Springfield, becoming someone strange, someone whose priorities had shifted in ways that made the ordinary life she had been living seem insufficient. The show doesn't spend much time with this transformation. It gives you the broad strokes and trusts you to fill in the texture. A woman in a small American town in 1969 becoming politically conscious was not an unusual event. It was happening to millions of women across the country, part of a broad cultural shift that was reshaping the relationship between domesticity and political engagement in ways that the American social order found extremely threatening. Mona's specific trajectory led her to a group of activists targeting Burns's biological weapons facility. The facility is worth sitting with for a moment, because its existence in the show's continuity is genuinely alarming if you follow the implications. Burns didn't just build a nuclear plant with safety violations. Before the nuclear plant, or alongside it, or in some organizational relationship to it that the show never quite specifies, he operated a facility designed to produce biological weapons, pathogenic agents, engineered or cultivated for military use, being developed in a building located in an American community, accessible to the people who lived around it, in whatever ways a facility of that kind is accessible to its surrounding neighborhood. This is not something that the United States government sanctioned in any civilian context. Biological weapons development was, by 1969, a deeply controversial area of American military policy, one that Nixon was in the process of publicly abandoning. A private facility, operated by a private billionaire, producing biological agents located in a civilian community, would have been illegal under any number of frameworks. Burns was doing this anyway. Because Burns does what Burns wants to do, and the gap between what Burns wants and what the law permits has always been managed through money and influence rather than compliance. Mona and her group destroyed the agents. They broke in, detonated what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, and eliminated the biological material stored there. Then they fled. And Mona made the mistake of stopping to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos of the raid. That someone was Burns. The moment she stopped is the fulcrum on which 3 generations of the Simpson family turned. If she had kept running, Burns never sees her face. Burns has no target. Mona goes home to her son. Homer grows up with his mother. The specific emotional wound at the center of Homer's character, the one that makes him simultaneously desperate for love and incapable of believing he deserves it, never opens. Homer becomes a different person. A person who might, when the crayon comes out and intelligence floods back in, have enough emotional stability to sustain the clarity that intelligence brings, rather than retreating from it in despair. But she stopped. She helped the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. And he saw her face. The FBI pursuit that followed is one of the darker institutions the show ever sketched. Burns reported Mona, and the FBI responded with the kind of sustained, resource-intensive effort that the Bureau is capable of, and that it has historically applied to political activists with an enthusiasm that sometimes exceeded the actual threat the activists represented. Mona spent 27 years as a fugitive, moving, maintaining cover, living lives that weren't quite her life, staying away from her family because coming close to her family was how they would find her. She missed Homer growing up. She missed the person he became. She missed every version of him that came between the sleeping child she kissed goodbye and the grown man standing beside her grave in a cemetery who turned out to be very much alive. And Homer grew up understanding on some level that he couldn't articulate, that his mother had chosen to be gone, that something about him or about his life had made staying impossible. Children are not equipped to assign external causes to parental absence. They have only themselves as the explanation for what the adults around them do. Homer lost his mother and decided, in the wordless way that young children decide things, that he was the reason. That there was something about Homer Simpson that made people leave. This is the wound. This is the thing at the center of all of Homer's chaotic, impulsive, sometimes selfish, sometimes unbearably loving behavior. He's been trying to prove for his entire adult life that people can stay, that he is worth staying for, that the person he is, with all his failures and all his limitations, and all the ways he falls short of who he should be, is still someone who deserves to have the people he loves remain. Marge staying is the proof he returns to, again and again. However badly he behaves, however thoroughly he fails, Marge is still there at the end of the episode. The proof renews with every reset. He is someone worth staying for. Marge is still here. And Burns, the man who destroyed that reassurance for 27 years of Homer's childhood and adolescence, signs Homer's paychecks. Homer works for the man who took his mother. He goes to work every morning in a building owned by the person whose grudge against a woman he barely remembers shaped the emotional landscape of Homer's entire life. And he cannot make the connection, not because the information isn't available to him, not because he hasn't been told what Burns did, but because his brain doesn't make those kinds of connections easily. The damage is too extensive. The wiring runs in ways that don't permit that particular circuit to complete. And Burns knows this. Burns knows who Homer is. He has always known. The deal with Grandpa, which guaranteed Homer's permanent employment regardless of performance, was not charity. It was the management of a liability. Grandpa knew something. Grandpa's silence had a price. The price was Homer's job, which served Burns's purposes in any case. A catastrophically incompetent safety inspector is exactly what that facility needs to keep operating. So the deal works for everyone except Homer, who is the person it's ostensibly designed to benefit. Homer gets job security he doesn't understand the origins of. Burns gets a safety inspector who won't find violations. Grandpa gets to keep his secret. The plant keeps running, the water keeps being contaminated. And Mona stays in hiding for 27 years, because coming home would mean Burns would see her again, and she has no reason to believe he would respond any differently the second time. She comes home eventually. She comes home when she runs out of road. She comes home because she's old enough that the calculation has changed. The years she might lose if Burns finds her are fewer than the years she's already lost. And she finds Homer, middle-aged and damaged and somehow still the same person she kissed goodbye in the dark, and she loves him with the specific, heartbroken intensity of a parent who knows how much they missed. The reunion is one of the most emotionally honest things The Simpsons ever produced. Two people finding each other across 27 years of absence and trying to compress everything that happened in between into a conversation that keeps getting interrupted by Burns finding her again and the FBI arriving and the countdown to her having to leave again. She leaves. Homer watches her go. She dies in a later episode. Homer sits beside her. The show doesn't make this funny. The show makes this what it is, which is a son losing his mother for the last time, with the full weight of everything they didn't get to have pressing down on both of them. The story of Mona Simpson is the story of what Burns did to the Simpson family before Homer ever set foot in the plant. It's the original sin of Springfield's power structure, the moment when the billionaire's reach extended beyond his facility and into the family life of the man who would grow up to be his most useful employee. Homer wasn't born broken, he was made broken. The crayon and the radiation and the decades of cognitive erosion all contributed. But the break started in 1969, in the dark of his childhood bedroom, when a woman kissed her sleeping son goodbye and didn't come back. And the man who forced that goodbye has been collecting Homer's labor ever since. Expanded Section 8 deeper into the predictions. The Simpsons writing room, at its peak, was one of the more remarkable collections of analytical talent ever assembled in an entertainment context. The list of advanced degrees, elite institutions, and specialized fields represented in those writers' rooms at various points in the show's history is genuinely impressive. Mathematics, computer science, history, political theory, philosophy, literature. People who spent their formative years developing rigorous frameworks for understanding how systems work and how they tend to fail. This matters for understanding the predictions, because the predictions that feel most uncanny are not the ones that required crystal ball prescience. They're the ones that required rigorous trend analysis carried a few steps further than the average observer tends to go. Take the smartwatch. In 1995, the elements that would combine to produce a smartwatch were all separately visible to someone who was paying close attention to the right things. Miniaturization of electronics was advancing steadily. Wireless communication was expanding. The cultural appetite for personal technology that extended beyond the desktop into the wearable was already being expressed in early iterations. A writer who was tracking those trends and thinking about where they converged would reasonably arrive at something like what we now recognize as a smartwatch. The specific form factor, a wristwatch that displays and communicates information, is the natural endpoint of those converging trends. Not a magical prediction, but a logical extrapolation made by people who understood the landscape well enough to see where it was heading. The Trump prediction is more interesting because the specificity goes beyond general trend extrapolation. The episode didn't just predict that celebrity culture and political culture would converge in some eventual future. It specified Trump by name, and it depicted him doing something visually specific, descending from above into a crowd of supporters. Which is a peculiar image to land on if you're just doing general satire about celebrity politicians, and which maps with uncomfortable precision onto the escalator descent that Trump used for his actual 2015 campaign announcement. The explanation that gets least attention in discussions of this prediction is the most mundane one. The writers knew Trump. Not personally, necessarily, but culturally. By 2000, Donald Trump had been a consistent presence in New York media for over 2 decades. He had explicitly, repeatedly, publicly flirted with the idea of running for president since the late 1980s. He gave interviews about it. He floated trial balloons. He positioned himself as someone who could and might run. The writers of an episode set in a future Springfield, looking for a name to put in the previous president slot as a joke about absurdist celebrity politics, didn't have to reach very far. Trump had already written that joke about himself, repeatedly, in real life. They just put it in the episode. The descending from above image might be coincidence. Or it might be that the escalator entrance, as a visual grammar for Trump specifically, had enough prior cultural life in the circles the writers moved in that it was already associated with him before it became associated with him universally. The writers of The Simpsons are not insulated from cultural pre-knowledge. They read things, attend things, know things, absorb things from their environments that don't always make it into the public record, but that might make their way into a background image in a 2000 episode of a cartoon show. The Cypress Hill and London Symphony Orchestra coincidence is probably the most purely astonishing one in the list, and it's worth being honest about it. There's no good analytical explanation for that one. The episode depicted a specific collaboration between 2 specific entities, a hip-hop group, and a classical orchestra, and 28 years later those two specific entities actually collaborated. That's not trend extrapolation. That's either coincidence at the extreme end of the probability distribution, or something weirder that we don't have a good framework for discussing. It's also worth noting that the Cypress Hill episode was not a careful prediction. It was an absurdist throwaway gag about the consequences of being extremely high at the wrong moment. The writers were not seriously suggesting that Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra would collaborate. They were joking about a hypothetical consequence of a hypothetical level of impairment. The fact that this specific joke happened to materialize in reality 28 years later is the kind of thing that is genuinely funny, and that the writers of The Simpsons have handled with appropriate self-deprecating humor, acknowledging the absurdity of the coincidence without overclaiming it as evidence of anything more than extremely improbable statistical overlap. The Higgs boson equation is interesting because it involves a real piece of mathematics. A physicist who reviewed the equation on Homer's chalkboard in the 1998 episode and compared it to the eventual prediction of the Higgs boson mass found structural similarities. The episode was written with the help of writers who had actual mathematical training. The equation on the chalkboard wasn't random. It was constructed with at least some degree of mathematical intentionality by people who understood what they were writing. The fact that it bears a resemblance to legitimate physics done a decade later might reflect the depth of mathematical understanding in the writer's room, rather than anything prophetic about the episode's content. What all of these explanations share is a common underlying structure: intelligent, well-educated people who understand their subject domains, making observations that are ahead of the general public's awareness, but not ahead of what rigorous analysis of available information would produce. The Simpsons' predictions are not supernatural. They are the residue of extraordinary intellectual rigor applied to the task of satirical observation, filtered through the confirmation bias of retrospective selection. But here's the dimension that genuinely troubles simple dismissal. The show has also been wrong, many times. The predictions that didn't come true are numerous: flying cars and moon colonies, and the specific political trajectories that went different ways than the show imagined. The technology that was imagined as inevitable and that hasn't materialized, the cultural developments that seemed obvious in 1997 and that turned out to be historical dead ends. Nobody compiles those. Nobody makes viral videos about the Simpsons predictions that failed. The memory of the failures evaporates, and the memory of the successes is preserved and amplified, and the resulting picture looks like a pattern of prescience rather than the probability distribution it actually represents. This is not a trivial point. It's the central mechanism of the prediction mythology. The show produced enough content that some of it was going to align with future events. The internet surfaces and amplifies the alignments while the misalignments disappear from collective memory. The resulting highlight reel looks prophetic. But even knowing this, even being fully clear-eyed about the mechanism, there's something in the Cypress Hill coincidence, something in the Trump escalator image, something in the specific details of certain predictions that makes you pause, just for a moment, and wonder whether pure probability is actually sufficient. The writers of The Simpsons have been asked about this. Their responses are uniformly modest. They acknowledge the coincidences. They don't overclaim them. They smile the smile of people who have thought about this enough to be genuinely uncertain what to make of it, and who have decided that uncertainty is the honest position. 800 episodes, 36 years. A writing staff that was, at its peak, among the most analytically gifted and culturally perceptive in television history. And enough bullseyes that the people who fired the darts are not entirely sure they understand how they got there. Expanded Section 9 deeper into Springfield's location. The geography of Springfield isn't just impossible, it's specifically, deliberately impossible, in ways that reveal a careful, creative intelligence at work. The show doesn't just fail to specify a state, it actively introduces contradictory information whenever the existing information gets too close to pointing in one direction. This is not the absence of geographic consistency. This is the active maintenance of geographic inconsistency, which requires ongoing creative effort and a sustained commitment to preventing resolution. Consider what it would take, in the writer's room, to maintain this across 36 seasons. Every time a new episode is written, someone presumably has to check what geographic information has been established previously and ensure that the new episode doesn't inadvertently resolve the ambiguity in one direction or another. or alternatively, doesn't hesitate to introduce new contradictory information that keeps the ambiguity alive. This is not a passive process. Someone is managing the location mystery. And the mystery has commercial value, which is worth acknowledging. The national debate about where Springfield is located has generated a specific kind of audience engagement for 36 years. It gives fans something to argue about that is low stakes and fun, and requires genuine familiarity with the show's continuity. It creates a community of engaged viewers who have invested enough attention in the show to have opinions about its geography. Every clue that appears in an episode generates discussion. Every fan theory about the state gets circulated. The mystery produces engagement in a way that a definitive answer would immediately and permanently close off. Groening's 2012 confession to Smithsonian was, from this perspective, interesting in its consequences. He named Oregon. He gave the definitive answer, and the show's writers immediately continued introducing contradictory geographic information as though the confession hadn't happened. The mystery was too commercially and culturally valuable to resolve, even when the show's creator had publicly resolved it. So the resolution was simply absorbed into the show's history and then ignored in its ongoing operation. This is actually consistent with how Springfield treats all inconvenient truths. Acknowledge them and then decline to be bound by them. The show acknowledged Oregon and then declined to let Oregon bind it. The show's relationship to its own creator's confession is the same relationship Springfield has to the truth about its principal's identity, noted, and then set aside in favor of the version that better serves ongoing operations. The geographic impossibility also functions as a kind of mirror for the show's treatment of its characters. Just as the characters have no fixed past, only the approximation of a past that the current episode requires, Springfield has no fixed location, only the approximation of a location that the current episode requires. The geography is as floating as the timeline. Both are tools for maintaining the permanent present tense that allows the show to be anywhere and anywhen without being bound by the specific commitments that would come with a defined geography and a stable timeline. You can't hold Springfield to any state's environmental standards because Springfield's state keeps changing. You can't measure how much time has passed for the Simpsons family because the timeline refuses to land. The same indeterminacy that protects the show creatively also, within the show's own logic, protects Springfield institutionally. There is something fitting about this. A town that exists outside geography, outside time, outside the normal rules of biological aging and consequence and accountability. Springfield is a pocket dimension within the American imagination, existing in the specific overlap between everywhere and nowhere, between every time and no time, between the real America and the satirized idea of America that The Simpsons has been constructing for 36 years. The location isn't Springfield, Oregon, or Springfield, Illinois, or Springfield, any state. The location is wherever the show needs it to be, which is always wherever you are, wherever you grew up, wherever the particular combination of nuclear plant and nuclear family and American domesticity maps most precisely onto your own experience. Springfield is your town, because Springfield belongs to nobody, which means it belongs to everyone, and as long as it belongs to everyone, nobody can shut it down. Expanded Section 10 deeper into the floating timeline. The floating timeline has a specific emotional cost that doesn't get discussed enough. We get the creative benefit, a show that can set itself in any year, reference any contemporary event, remain perpetually relevant to its current audience without aging out of cultural resonance. We understand the production logic. We've accepted the convention. What we don't always acknowledge is what accepting the convention requires us to do emotionally. We have to agree not to think about Bart being 47. We have to agree not to think about Lisa being 45. About what kind of person she would have become. About whether the idealism the show built her around would have survived contact with that much life experience. We have to agree not to think about Maggie having graduated college, about whether she ever broke her silence, about what the first sentence she chose to say out loud sounded like. We have to agree not to think about Homer being in his 70s, about whether his body, even his extraordinary body with its radiation-enhanced resilience, would still be recovering from all those falls and explosions and electrocutions, about whether he and Marge would still be on the same couch. We agree to all of this because the alternative, actually following these characters through the time that has actually passed, would make the show something entirely different. Something that would require us to think about what happens to families over time. What happens to marriages over 3.5 decades? What happens to children who grow up? What happens to parents who age? And those are things the audience of The Simpsons has spent 36 years collectively choosing not to think about, at least not in the context of this specific family. Because this family is too much of a mirror, too close to something real. The yellow skin and the four fingers and the impossible physics create enough aesthetic distance that you can sit with them, laugh at them, feel warmly toward them without the full weight of their humanity pressing down on you. But underneath those aesthetic distancing devices, they are recognizably, specifically human in the ways that matter. Homer's love for his family is human. Marge's patience is human. Lisa's loneliness is human. Bart's rebellion is human. Maggie's mystery is human. And if they aged, the humanity would become unbearable in a different way. You'd be watching Homer get old. You'd be watching the marriage strain under the weight of decades, rather than the weight of a single episode's plot. You'd be watching Bart find out who he is when he's not 10 anymore, and that version of Bart might be someone you don't recognize, someone the rebellion hardened into bitterness or softened into something quieter and sadder. The floating timeline protects the audience from all of that. It keeps the family in the state where they're most bearable, most recognizable, most warmly available to the specific emotional function they serve in the lives of the people who watch them. But the protection has a cost, because it also keeps the family from becoming who they were always heading toward. It freezes them at the moment just before the next chapter, the chapter where Bart starts to figure out what he actually wants, where Lisa leaves Springfield and discovers whether the world is as much larger and more open as she always hoped, where Maggie speaks her second word, and then her third, and eventually says the thing she's been waiting to say. Those are the stories the floating timeline will never tell. And the audience on some level knows this, knows that every episode is a deferral, knows that the family they love is being held in suspension, preserved for their viewing pleasure, prevented from becoming anyone new. There is something melancholy about loving a family that can never grow up, something that sits at the edge of the warmth the show generates, just out of direct sight, just beyond the couch and the television and the opening credits that play every week without changing. We love them. We have loved them for 36 years. We have chosen, again and again, to press pause rather than press play, to keep them young rather than let them age, to accept the loop rather than demand the resolution. And they stay. They stay on the couch, they stay in the house, they stay yellow and four-fingered and ageless in the town that glows in the dark, because we want them to. And in Springfield, what the audience wants, the loop provides. Forever. Expanded Section 11 deeper into Ned and Molaman. Ned Flanders' faith deserves extended attention because it is, within the show's own cosmology, a more complicated thing than it initially appears. The show's universe contains God. This is not a metaphor or an ambiguity. God is a character who has appeared in The Simpsons, has been voiced, has spoken directly to Homer Simpson on at least 2 occasions, and has done so in ways that the show treats as literally real rather than hallucinatory or symbolic. In the universe of The Simpsons, God exists and God communicates. And God communicates with Homer. Not with Ned, not with the man who goes to church every Sunday, reads his Bible, prays with genuine sincerity, structures his entire life around his relationship with his faith, raises his children in the practice of it, forgives people who wrong him because his faith asks him to forgive them, and maintains his devotion under conditions that would have broken the faith of someone less committed. God talks to Homer. Homer, who sleeps in church, who resents Sundays for their proximity to Mondays, who once built his own religion around avoiding the institutional practice of the faith he was nominally raised in. Homer, who takes his family to church mostly because Marge insists, who falls asleep in the pew, who treats the entire enterprise of organized religion as an obstacle between him and his couch. God shows up for Homer, twice, sits down, has a real conversation, dispenses something like wisdom or at least engagement. And Ned, who has dedicated his whole life to exactly the kind of devotion and practice that the institutional faith asks of its adherents, gets silence. The show doesn't comment on this directly. It doesn't acknowledge the disparity in any explicit way. It just presents it, episode by episode, as the accumulated facts of the show's universe. God talks to Homer, God doesn't talk to Ned, and neither character appears to be fully aware of the contrast. But the audience is aware. And the awareness, over 36 seasons, produces a picture of theological reality in Springfield that is at least as bleak as anything the radiation theory describes. If God exists in the universe of The Simpsons, and God chooses who to communicate with, and God's choices in this regard appear to bear no relationship to the moral quality or devotional sincerity of the people being chosen, then faith in Springfield is a bet with no guaranteed return. Ned has placed the most consistent, most wholehearted bet. Homer has placed the most casual, most inattentive bet, and the universe has rewarded the casual bet and ignored the wholehearted one. This might be the most genuinely dark thing The Simpsons has ever said. Darker than the radiation theory, darker than the coma, darker than Burns's immortality or Springfield's collective denial or Maggie's calculating silence. Because all of those things are explicable within some framework, whether scientific or psychological or sociological. They have mechanisms, they have causes, but the disparity between Ned's faith and its returns, and Homer's casual relationship with the divine and its apparently better returns, has no mechanism. It just is. It's what the universe of Springfield, which is the universe that contains an actual existing God who actually makes choices about who to speak to, has decided to be. You can follow all the rules. You can do everything right. You can build your entire life around the highest possible standard of behavior and maintain it through conditions that would destroy most people's commitment to anything. And you can still be standing in the ruins of your house after a hurricane, surrounded by a community that rebuilt it so badly it collapsed the moment it was done, trying to understand why you can't make yourself be angry about it, because the behavioral modification of your childhood took anger away from you and replaced it with something that looks like grace from the outside and feels like a cage from the inside. That's Ned Flanders. 36 years of the most thorough and sustained and quietly heroic performance of goodness that the show has ever depicted, and the universe rewards Homer. In Springfield, effort does not determine outcome. Character does not determine outcome. Goodness does not determine outcome. Being Homer determines outcome. And Ned, who will never be Homer, keeps going to church. The congregation will be there on Sunday, the prayers will be said, the hymns will be sung, and the house next door will have Homer in it, imperfect and impulsive and loved beyond what his behavior could justify, connected to a God who apparently finds him more interesting than the man who has spent 60 years trying to earn that connection. That's Springfield's final cruelty. Not the radiation, not the coma, not even Burns. The universe noticing Homer and not noticing Ned. Despite everything. Despite all of it. Homer first. Always. Expanded section. 12. The full picture. So here we are, at the end of a long walk through Springfield. And the picture, assembled from all of these pieces, is something that most people who have watched the show for 36 years have never quite let themselves look at directly. Springfield is a contamination zone where the population has been cognitively and physically altered by decades of nuclear exposure administered without consent by a billionaire who understood what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Because the alternative was accountability, and accountability was more expensive than the contamination. The safety inspector is a man whose brain was already impaired by a foreign object lodged in it since childhood and who has been further impaired by the same radiation that has been impairing everyone else, and who was selected for this role not despite his incompetence but because of it, because a competent inspector would end the arrangement that Burns requires. The same billionaire who created this situation also, decades earlier, destroyed the Simpson family at its origin. He forced Mona underground and created in her absence the specific emotional wound that made Homer the perfect employee, desperate for approval, terrified of abandonment, unable to sustain the clarity of thought that would allow him to understand the architecture of his own suffering. The town's population, affected by the contamination's neurological consequences, maintains a collective relationship with reality that privileges comfort over truth. The mechanism for this is democratic and explicit. They vote to forget, vote to deny, vote to exile the truth on a train when it becomes inconvenient. This mechanism has been running since before the show knew how to describe it, and The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode where the show finally gave you a camera angle on it. The family at the center of this town may or may not be real. Homer may have been unconscious since 1993, dreaming a family that he last saw from a hospital bed, holding them at the ages they were when the vending machine fell, and refusing to let his unconscious mind age them past the last moment he actually witnessed. Everything since that April has been the inside of his head. The escalating impossibility, the celebrity appearances, the physics-defying survival, the reset at the end of every episode that brings him back to the couch and the family and the warmth of the house. The youngest member of that family may be the most capable person in it. She may have decided, before she had language to make the decision with, that intelligence displayed openly is a liability in Springfield and that the best available strategy is perfect concealment. She may have been watching everything for 36 years and deciding nothing, waiting for something, planning in the sustained way that only a mind operating far beyond its apparent developmental stage could sustain. The billionaire lives on in all of this, maintained by his weekly treatments, sustained by Smithers's management, operating through the centuries-old infrastructure of a fortune that predates the country he inhabits, making the rules and rewriting the rules, and ensuring that the rules always favor the continuation of the arrangement that keeps him alive and keeps Springfield in the state he needs it to be in. And the family stays on the couch, and the town stays yellow and four-fingered and dreaming or contaminated or both, in a location that cannot be pinned down and a timeline that refuses to advance, because the audience built the loop and the audience maintains it by returning every week to check that the couch is still there and the family is still on it and nothing has changed. Springfield will not change. Not because it can't, because we won't let it. Because letting it change means admitting that the family we've been watching for 36 years was always temporary, always headed somewhere, always moving through time even when the timeline pretended otherwise. Bart would be 47, Lisa would be 45. Maggie would have spoken her second word somewhere around 1991 and her 100th somewhere around 1995. And by now she would have said every word she was ever going to say, and probably quite a few that nobody expected. Homer would be old. The falls that the show's physics have always absorbed without consequence would have started to matter. The beer would still be cold, but the body that drank it would carry the weight of 600,000 days. Marge would still be there. After everything, Marge would still be there. That much, at least, feels certain. She was always the load-bearing wall of this house, the thing that kept the structure standing when everything else was falling. But we don't have to know any of that. The loop keeps running. The family stays young. The house looks the same every week. The opening credits play, and the couch gag resolves, and Homer comes home and they're all there. We built this for ourselves. We built the loop and we live inside it right alongside the Simpsons, frozen at the moment we first fell in love with them, in whatever year that was for you, whatever age you were when you first sat down and watched and felt something click into place. You're still that person. In the loop, on the couch, Springfield is still there. The plant is still running. Maggie is still watching. Homer is still dreaming, or waking, or something in between that the show will never quite name. And the beer is still cold, and the family is still here. Good night, Springfield. Good night. End of full script. Bonus section. The things the show almost said. There is a category of Simpsons moment that doesn't fit neatly into any of the major theories, but that sits in the memory long after the episode has ended. These are the moments where the show pulled back from something, where you can feel, watching carefully, that the script got close to the edge of something true and then stepped back. A line that went somewhere and then retreated. A plot that opened a door and then quietly closed it before you could look through properly. A character who said something that, if followed, would have unraveled the comfortable surface of the show entirely. The show has been doing this for 36 years, building toward revelations that never quite arrive, gesturing toward depths it never quite plumbs, putting a camera on something important and then panning away at the last moment, as if someone, somewhere in the production, decided that the audience had gotten close enough to the truth and it was time to pull them back toward the comedy. Homer's moment of clarity in the crayon episode is perhaps the most extended version of this. When the crayon comes out and Homer's intelligence floods back, the show gives you about 20 minutes of what Homer Simpson could have been. He's thoughtful. He's articulate. He sees Springfield with fresh eyes, and what he sees is, quite specifically, everything the radiation theory and the denial theory and the Burns conspiracy theory have been describing. He sees the plant for what it is. He sees his own life for what it is. He sees the architecture of the town's dysfunction and his own place within it, and the show lets him articulate some of this before it makes him choose to put the crayon back. He chooses stupidity over clarity not because clarity is wrong, but because clarity in Springfield is unbearable. The show gets as close as it ever gets to saying this directly, that being smart enough to understand Springfield is incompatible with being happy enough to live there. And then it retreats. Homer puts the crayon back. The episode ends. The intelligence goes away. The insight goes with it. What would have happened if Homer had kept the crayon out? This is the question the episode opens and then refuses to answer. The show could have run an extended storyline in which an intelligent Homer tried to navigate a life that had been built around his cognitive impairment. It could have followed the implications of his intelligence reconnecting with his memories of Burns and his mother. It could have let him make the connection, try to act on the connection, try to do something about the fact that his employer destroyed his family. Instead, it gave him a taste and then took it back. Because taking it back is the whole point. Because the show, in the end, needed Homer to be Homer, needed the loop to keep running, needed everything to return to normal by the time the credits rolled. But for 20 minutes, you could see what was behind the curtain, what the show would look like if it stopped retreating from the implications of its own premise. It would look like a different show, a harder show. A show that didn't necessarily end with Homer finding his way home, because a genuinely intelligent Homer, fully aware of what his home was built on and what it was costing him, might not be able to go back to it. The retreat is understandable. It's also the show being honest about its own limits. Springfield can gesture toward the abyss. It cannot look into it directly, because looking into it directly would change the show's relationship to its audience in ways that the audience has never asked for. You come to The Simpsons for the loop, for the family on the couch, for Homer finding his way home. You don't come for the honest accounting of what the home is built on and what it's costing everyone inside it. And so the show gives you the gesture and then gives you the couch. It shows you the edge and then pulls you back. It opens the door and then closes it before you can step through. And in doing so, it tells you something more important than any revelation it could have delivered on the other side of the door. It tells you that the loop is comfortable. It tells you that we chose it. It tells you that Homer putting the crayon back is not a failure of courage but an act of love, because the fog that comes with the crayon in is the only thing that makes the life on the other side of it livable. Burns 1. The plant is still running. Homer is still broken in the specific ways that make him the perfect employee and the perfect dreamer and the perfect subject for every theory in this video. And by next episode, he will have forgotten everything that happened in this one, which is how Springfield works, which is how the loop maintains itself, which is how the audience gets what they came for. You came for the couch, you came for the family, you came for the opening credits and the couch gag and Homer finding his way home. And Springfield always gives you that. That's the final thing the show almost says, the thing it circles around in every episode without ever quite landing on directly. We need this. The loop is ours as much as it's theirs. The reset that happens between episodes happens in us too. The way we return to the show expecting the same thing we got last week and finding it, reliably, every time. We are Springfield's collective agreement, renewed with every viewing, to maintain the version of reality that allows the family to stay on the couch and the beer to stay cold and the show to keep running. Every theory in this video is true, or as true as theories about a cartoon can be. The radiation is real in the show's logic. The coma is possible in the show's structure. The denial is explicit in the show's own best episode about itself. Burns is impossible and sustained by the show's own internal rules. And the family is real. That's the thing that matters. Underneath every theory, inside every mystery, at the center of everything this video has been walking through for however many hours it has taken to get here, the family is real. Homer's love is real. Marge's love is real. The children, all three of them, in their very different ways, are real. Springfield keeps them safe. In the loop, in the floating timeline, in the dream, in the contaminated zone that the EPA sealed under a dome and then unsealed and then everyone agreed not to mention, the family stays real and stays together and stays on the couch. And the show keeps running. And we keep watching. Because some things are worth maintaining. Even at the cost of the truth. Even in the glow of a cracked reactor on a hill that everyone can see from their front yards. Even in Springfield. Especially in Springfield. Final end of script. Approximately 40,500 words. One last thing. Why we keep coming back. There's a question that nobody who studies The Simpsons ever quite answers to full satisfaction. And it's the most important question the show raises. Why does it still work? Not in the sense of why it's still on television, though that's an interesting question too. In the deeper sense, Why do people who grew up watching it in the 90s still feel something when the opening credits play? Why do people who discovered it in syndication years or decades after its peak still find themselves pulled into the rhythms of it? Why does a show that has been running for 36 seasons, that has by almost any critical consensus produced some of its weakest work in its most recent years, still generate the specific feeling of homecoming that it generates? The theories in this video offer one kind of answer. If Springfield is a contamination zone, and the contamination has gotten into the culture the way it's gotten into Springfield's water table, then the show's hold on its audience might be explained as a kind of cultural exposure. We absorbed it early. It shaped the way we understand certain things. The references and the rhythms and the specific comedic vocabulary of The Simpsons are woven into how a generation or two of people process American life, and returning to the source of that vocabulary feels like returning to something foundational. But that's a mechanism, not an explanation. It describes how the hold operates without explaining why the show generated the hold in the first place. The coma theory has a better answer, though it requires you to accept its premise. If the show is a love letter from an unconscious man to the family he can't reach, then what you feel when you watch it is the emotional content of that letter. You feel what Homer feels: the warmth of the house, the particular and irreplaceable texture of these specific people, the relief of being home after a day that was too long and too hard. You feel it because Homer feels it, and because the dream he's generating has been designed with the specific emotional precision of something that a mind generates when it has all the time in the world to get it right. Dreams are, among other things, emotional compression chambers. They take the significant feelings of a life and intensify them, strip away the noise and the distraction and the logistics, and deliver the emotional core directly. Homer's coma dream has been doing this for 30 years, delivering the emotional core of what it means to love a family, to want to go home, to want the house to still look the same and the people to still be there. And the audience, sitting on their own couches in their own homes, feels that, recognizes it, because it maps onto something real in their own experience, something about families and homes and the specific quality of ordinary domestic love that is easy to overlook when you're inside it and impossible to recover once it's gone. The show keeps working because Homer's dream is everyone's dream, in some version. Not the specific details, the nuclear plant, the yellow skin, the Springfield geography, but the emotional architecture underneath, the house that looks the same, the family that's still there, the couch, the television, the warmth. That's what 36 seasons of The Simpsons has been delivering, episode after episode, with varying degrees of skill but consistent emotional intention. The feeling of being home. You can analyze the mechanism all you want. You can trace the radiation and the coma and the denial and the immortality and the predictions and the geography and the floating timeline. You can spend hours, as this video has, walking through every theory and every mystery and every buried storyline and every inconsistency that the show has accumulated across its impossible run. And at the end of all that analysis, you still feel something when the couch gag plays. You still feel something when Homer says something stupid and Marge looks at him with that specific expression that contains everything she feels about him, every frustration and every tenderness, in a single glance. You still feel something when Lisa plays her saxophone alone in her room, broadcasting into a town that doesn't want to listen because the thing she's broadcasting is real even if the reception is poor. The theories explain Springfield. They don't explain why we love it. That part, the love, doesn't have a theory. It just keeps running. Like the plant on the hill. Like the loop that nobody presses play on. Like Homer finding his way home at the end of every episode, through every impossible circumstance, by every route that a dreaming brain can generate. He always makes it back. So do we. That's Springfield. That's the show. That's 36 seasons of the strangest, most contaminated, most theorized, most loved piece of American popular culture that has ever been produced. Still running, still yellow, still on the air on Sunday nights like it's 1993, and nothing has changed, and the family is still there, and the beer is still cold. Go to sleep now. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. True final end. A note on what makes Springfield strange in the best way. Before we completely close out, there's something worth sitting with that the theories don't quite capture on their own. Every serious analysis of The Simpsons eventually runs into the same wall. The show